Schuler states that few in Washington will admit Congress has a knack for starting any proposed cuts in the later years while letting spending run wild in the immediate future. Sometimes these predictions are off by $1 trillion or so because the economy grew more slowly or more quickly than anticipated. Bruce Thompson, a former Senate aide and Assistant Secretary of Treasury, writes, "The Congressional Budget Office miscalculated the deficit last year by $1 trillion. So in deciding whether to vote for any big, monstrous bill, it helps to ask the right question. To me, the most pertinent question is how will the bill affect the deficit in the next year? Currently, our deficit is estimated to be a little under $2 trillion this year. What will happen to the debt in 2026 if this bill passes? Well, using the math most favorable to the supporters of the bill, referred to as the policy baseline, the deficit in 2026 will still be $270 billion more than this year. So even using the math, even using the formulas that the supporters of the bill like, the deficit will grow by $270 billion next year. That's just not good if you profess to be fiscally conservative. Why will the deficit grow next year? Well, even if you argue that the 2017 tax cuts don't need to be counted in the calculation at all, the new tax cuts add up to $234 billion to the debt next year. In addition, the big not-so-beautiful bill adds new spending of over $500 billion, military, border, agricultural subsidies, etc. That spending is front-loaded and will be spent in the first 4 years of the 10-year window. Legislative spending is one of the few items in the bill that is exact. It isn't estimated. If they say they'll spend $500 billion, they're going to spend $500 billion, all in the first few years. So in order not to add to the deficit, the BBB, the big not-so-beautiful bill, has to have corresponding spending cuts to counter all the new spending. Unfortunately, the spending cuts are backloaded to the final 5 years of the 10-year window when several tax cuts expire and the spending increases are finished. In addition, elections occur every 2 years and could easily wipe out any perceived savings that might occur in the later years. The only real certainty in this budget drama are the budget years coming in the immediate future. It's the next year or two are the only things that are actually of any certainty. So if we analyze this bill from that perspective, we discover that the bill increases the debt by $500 billion in the first 5 years. This is not the CBO projection that Republicans have not liked. This is the projection they are using, says the debt will add $500 billion in the first 5 years. Now, they say somehow, miraculously, in the last 5 years, it gets to a $500 billion in savings. So it's $1 trillion shift from year 5 to year 10. The CBO scores it differently, not as encouraging, and says it adds over $3 trillion in debt. So which is it? Does this bill save $500 billion over 10, or does it add $3 trillion over 10? The truth is that anybody, that even a person with a magic crystal ball, it's anybody's guess. Which brings us back to maybe we have to judge the effects of the big, not-so-beautiful bill by looking at what happens to the debt next year. Supporters of the bill admit it adds $270 billion to the debt next year. That's the only thing we know for certain. We don't know what happens in year 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, but we know next year this bill will grow the deficit by $270 billion. In addition, the bill increases the debt ceiling by $5 trillion. What does that mean? That is an admission that they know they aren't controlling the deficit. They know that the ensuing years will add trillions more. So we're adding $2 trillion this year, but they're anticipating, the authors of the bill anticipating adding more than $2 trillion next year. That doesn't sound at all conservative to me, and that's why I'm a no.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Oregon.
Mr. President, joining me on the floor are experts in the budget process, former chairs and ranking members, Senator Murray, who's been Senate Budget Chair from 2013 to 2015, Senator Whitehouse, who's Senate Budget Chair 2023 through 2025, Senator Van Hollen, who was the ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee in 2011 through 2017. We're here to address a fundamental violation of the law, of Law 313, Section 313, and it is the set of rules for reconciliation. To try to summarize this in the simplest words possible, 100 senators voted to have a special fast-track, filibuster-free pathway solely for reducing the debt. First principle was no deficits could be created in a 10-year period. My Republican colleagues blew that up in 1996 when they wanted to do a tax bill that would create massive deficits. Then, a second pillar was no deficits in any title of the bill in any year after the first 10 years. This bill right now, if this passes, that blows that up. And the third was use honest numbers, Congressional Budget Office numbers. I have a letter here from the Congressional Budget Office, and they say, the estimate is relative to CBO's January 2025 baseline. CBO is required to construct its baseline under the assumptions specified in the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act and the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act. In response to your questions about the cost of Title VII, the question was, would Title VII increase the deficit by more than the $1.5 trillion over the 2025 through 34 period? The answer is yes. CBO estimates that enacting would increase the deficit by nearly $3.5 trillion over the 2025-2034 period, $3.5 trillion. We then asked, would it increase deficits in the years beyond 2034, beyond the 10-year window? The answer was yes. But if you ask my Republican friends, they say, no, no, no. We're inventing a new theory, and that is that anything that the 2017 tax giveaway to the billionaires put into the law that expired after 10 years, we're just going to assume it would have continued, and therefore, us continuing it doesn't cost anything. That's a pretty crazy notion, that if they didn't put it into the bill, the law says it ends, but they say, no, no, it would have continued anyway through some magical way. So therefore, a tax break for the really wealthy costs nothing. This is exactly the type of lying to ourselves, smoke and mirrors that 100 senators agreed to end back in 1974. And that it has continued, that piece of it has continued in place for 51 years until this moment. In this Senate, by this Republican majority, says we're going to start lying to ourselves and lying to the American people about what this bill costs. But we're not going to lie. We're going to tell you the truth. This bill costs well over $3 trillion over 10 years and some $30+ trillion on top of existing deficits and debt because of the provisions that are in this particular bill. Our current debt, national debt, that's been run up since the Declaration of Independence is around $36.5 trillion. This bill basically matches that in creating that much additional debt over the next 30 years. This is a huge assault on the programs that we can sustain as a nation for the people of America, people struggling to get on their feet. So we want affordable housing programs. We want to have fair and quality health care. We want to have an education system that gives every child the opportunity to thrive. We want to create a robust economy through investment so there are good jobs, because no government program is better than a good job. All those imperiled by this bill because the Republican leadership is lying to the American people and lying to ourselves. So we're here to tell the truth, and first of all, we're going to turn to Senator Murray, who, as I mentioned, was the Senate Budget Chair from 2013 to 2015.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Washington State.
I thank the senator from Oregon and our other budget chairs, ranking members from previous years, because this is really important. Mr. President, there are some things you can't change with legislation, despite what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to believe. For example, 1 + 1 is 2. And while a trillion might have a lot of zeros in it, it is, in fact, a much, much bigger number. Now, that might sound obvious, but apparently my colleagues across the aisle need a little reminder, because right now, Republicans are pretending not to get it. It is almost beyond belief, and it is certainly beyond common sense. After years of complaining about the debt, in fact, at the same time they're talking about how we need to address the debt, Republicans now are suddenly pretending they don't know how to count. Republicans are suddenly pretending the parliamentarian doesn't exist if they don't talk to her. Republicans are suddenly pretending that precedent doesn't exist if they just fake amnesia, and that norms and consequences for breaking them will just disappear if they wish it away really hard. My preschool students had more common sense. Republicans should know if they replace math with magic, if they tear up the Senate process, if they blow off the Senate parliamentarian, that bill will come due. And not just the bill for $4 trillion blown on tax cuts for billionaires and corporations. The bill will also come due for trashing this Senate process and precedent when Republicans are no longer in the majority. Mr. President, if Republicans are serious about plowing forward with rewriting or ignoring Senate procedure and the laws of mathematics, I just ask, spare me the empty excuses. Spare me the explanations that totally ignore the reality of what you are doing. I mean, do they really think it washes away everything to say, oh, it's fine to break the process in half because we say it's fine? Oh, it's fine. We have the authority to ignore math. Give me a break. To every Republican who really thinks that is a convincing argument, to anyone who thinks we can is just an acceptable rationale for going nuclear and pretending the most expensive bill in the history of our country can be paid for by some magic bean counting, here is my challenge to you. Go back home and try that game with your constituents. Tell them, it's okay, yes, the debt's going to be $4 trillion, higher 10 years from now. That's true. But it's fine. We voted on it. And we get to say $1 trillion is actually 0. Go ahead. See how that works for you. And you may as well tell them you are voting against gravity next, because that's just as reasonable. And don't forget, when you tell your families back home that trillions of dollars in tax cuts for billionaires and companies are free because you waved a wand or you said some magic words, don't forget to tell them those are just tax cuts for the billionaires, not for working families. Don't forget to tell the folks back home, yeah, I voted to say $1 trillion is nothing, but we still need to kick people off of their health care. That's just too expensive. We still need to close those hospitals. We have to cut costs, and we still have to kick people off SNAP because the debt is out of control. And don't forget to mention that, no, we can't afford childcare. We can't afford paid family leave. We can't afford to solve your problems. Magic math is apparently just for billionaires. You all are getting less. Please, Republicans, send that message to your constituents. Just see how it goes over. Because you can fool yourself, but you are not going to fool the American people. They don't get to balance their budget with magic math. They don't get to pretend $1 trillion is nothing. And they don't get to pretend that this bill is free. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what policy baseline you all want to use in DC, those families back home, they're the ones who will be paying the actual cost. I yield back to the Senator from Oregon.
I yield to a question.
I would.
In the time that you were budget chair, did you ever contemplate a situation in which you argued that renewing a tax break that was by law expiring would somehow have no impact on the deficit?
to my friend from Oregon, I never would have contemplated it, and I never would have put it forward. And I happen to know that if I had have suggested that my Republican colleagues would have been all over me, telling me that breaks the rules.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're turning to Senator Whitehouse, who was Senate Budget Chair from 2023 to 2025.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. I mentioned earlier the history of the section that the Republican budget chairman is using to perform this multi-trillion-dollar magical act of making huge deficit-busting numbers disappear. It's called Section 312. It has been used before, but it has always been minor, corrective, and bipartisan. I mentioned earlier the adjustment that was made on a bipartisan basis to the Power Marketing Administration's numbers to return the CBO to an agreement that the Senate had previously made. That was not enormously consequential. This is almost certainly the first time you're hearing about it. Again, in 2023, as budget chair with Republican Chair Jody Arrington on the House side, we made a $105 million adjustment to a dairy program. Today we're talking about trillions. This was a $105 million adjustment. Again, bipartisan, minor, and corrective, fixing a technical issue on a bipartisan basis. Last year, Speaker Johnson and Leader Schumer agreed to direct CBO to score a fee program with an OMB estimate, and they used this rule again, collaborating on a bipartisan basis with a matter that was minor and corrective. Well, this is different. This is trillions. And Republicans are using this rule to pretend that it's not. Well, there are lots of ways to look at who's right. Time obviously will tell, but this bill actually has a tell right in it. Page 754 of this bill is the reality check on whether or not they're running up the debt by trillions. We know they're running up the debt by trillions because they say so in this bill. You can play Senate procedural fakery. You can wave magic wands around numbers all day long. But someday, soon, you hit reality. And you hit reality in the real world of markets and selling treasury bonds and having a legal debt limit. If this did not raise the debt by trillions, they would not need to raise the debt limit by trillions. Here is the text. Subtitle C, increase in debt limit. Section 72001, modification of limitation on the public debt. The limitation under Section 3101B of Title 31 is increased by $5 trillion. They're dodging the parliamentarians' ruling by letting the budget chair make a $1 trillion magic wand maneuver because they know pretty darn well what the parliamentarians' ruling would be. And how do they know what the parliamentarians' ruling would be? Because the answer's in their own damn bill. I yield the floor.
Would the senator from Rhode Island yield for a question?
Of course.
You mentioned the use of Section 312, which gives some flexibility to resolve, as you put it, minor issues on a bipartisan basis to correct an issue, a technical issue. In those cases you mentioned, were those on a reconciliation bill?
Were they on a reconciliation bill? I don't believe they were.
No, they were not.
They were
In fact, that power has never been used on a reconciliation bill because the following Section 313 gives very specific instructions. It says each provision must be costed out for its impact on both outlays, the spending side, or revenue, should it be a revenue measure. And if you're saying, well, how do I do that? You say, well, if we pass this provision, what will it cost as compared to not passing this provision, not having the bill? That's a comparison to current law. This ability of the budget chair, and actually the law says the Budget Committee, to correct technical issues on narrow issues on a bipartisan basis, basically solve snarly little budgeting questions like on the dairy program you mentioned, never used on reconciliation ever, never used on a broad basis ever, never used to create a lie about what a bill costs in this fashion. Now we're turning to Senator from Maryland, who was ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee for 6 years. So he brings a lot of experience and knowledge about the budget process. Senator Van Hollen.
Well, Mr. President, I thank my colleague and the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, Senator Merkley. I just want to start by reading a statement. This is a quote. Anyone that says current policy baseline is the right way to go is engaging in intellectual and economic fraud. It's intellectually lazy. My basic mission in life is just to try to create some honest math, unquote. That wasn't from Senator Van Hollen or anyone on this floor. This was from a Republican member of the House, Congressman Schweikert from Arizona, talking about exactly the issue we're debating here in the United States Senate. Let me read you another quote, a little more colorful. Again, about this Republican accounting fraud. Quote, this is fairy dust, and they're just full of crap, and I'm going to call them out on it. Republican Congressman Chip Roy of Texas. They're right. This is a fraud. This is a fraud that would make the Enron scammers blush. And I quote those House members for a reason, because we can disagree with what they did in their bill, and I strongly disagree with it. But at least they used honest math, and at least they used the math that is required by the rules here in the Senate. The honest math that Republicans here in the Senate want to dodge, because it will both tell the American people just how big the deficits are, but also because it will screw up their whole entire plan. Just so people listening have some sense of how these Senate numbers are designed to disguise the real impact of their deficits. Look at, for example, the basic individual tax rates in the House bill. When they extended those tax rates from the Trump 2017 bill, it costs $2.2 trillion under what we call the current law baseline, which is the reality baseline, because that's what it will cost when you understand that they sunset at the end of this year, and that's what it will cost to renew them. So under honest accounting, it's $2.2 trillion. Under the Senate fraudulent accounting, that $2.2 trillion deficit miraculously becomes an $83 billion deficit. Let's look at the House permanent extension of key deductions for businesses. That would cost honest accounting $821 billion. Under the Senate accounting scam, $6 billion. So what we're seeing here is this blatant, deliberate effort to mislead the American people about the true costs of this bill, about the deficit impacts of this bill, about how it will impact the debt. And we all know that when the debt goes up and we have to put more of our costs on Uncle Sam's credit card, it puts upward pressure on interest rates. That means Americans will pay higher interest rates on their mortgages, on their car loans, and everything else. So when you try to hide the deficit impact, you really are trying to fool the American people, and we're here to blow the whistle. Now, I just want to show our colleagues something that was put together by the Committee for a Responsible Budget. And if you look at the blue, you can see for each year, starting this year, 2025, 2006, the blue is what Senate Republicans claim their bill will add to the deficit. The red is how much more it will actually add to the deficit. So at the end of this 10-year period, what you see is Senate Republicans are claiming that their bill will add $441 billion, which is still a big number, but the real number when you do honest accounting, when you add up all of these, it's $4.2 trillion, a much bigger number. Now, I do want to point something out on this chart. I think everybody watching should understand it. If you look at these orange parts, these are the additional deficits from tax cuts. Starting here in year 2029, 2030, you'll see that they actually do start going down. Why is that? It's because the tax cut that President Trump promised for no tax on tips, they phased those out. This is all just a make-believe ruse. Yeah, we start providing no tax on tips, but those disappear. The tax breaks for wealthy people, they go on, and they go on not just for this 10-year period, but the reason they violate all the rules of reconciliation is because they keep going on after that. And as Senator Merkley said, if you look at the entire history of the Byrd rule, that's Senator Byrd, it was designed to make sure that 51 senators through a vote could not make these kind of permanent changes in any area, but specifically they were worried about areas that increased the national deficit and debt. So what Republican senators are doing is not only misleading the American people, but they're violating the entire structure that carved out this special procedure that we call reconciliation for the budget, which was intended to lower deficits and debts, not have them go on forever. As Senator Merkley has pointed out, I think if you look over a 30-year period, we're talking about $35 trillion plus additional to the debt. And Republicans want to hide that from the American people. That is budget fraud, pure and simple, and it is a violation of the rules of the United States Senate. This whole special structure that was created not to blow bigger holes in the debt and deficits, but to actually try to constrain them. So shame on everybody who's part of this fraud on the American people. I yield back my time.
Would the senator from Maryland yield for a question?
I will.
I found it very interesting that you pointed out that these tax provisions for the middle class, no tax on tips, is phased out, and no tax on overtime is phased out. And what you're saying, I believe, is that when they put into this bill that a tax break is ending, they're saying that it doesn't cost any more in the following years.
So they are certainly saying that their current policy baseline that they want us to make believe about would say that this wouldn't cost them. In other words, if they extended this, it wouldn't cost anything. It is interesting to note, not only does that expose the fraud behind the current policy baseline, but they made a very deliberate choice. Even though they now say that they can make these tax cuts permanent and still comply with the rules, they decided to make the tax cuts for very rich people permanent. But even though they say it's not going to cost anything anymore to provide, tax cuts with no tax on tips, they're phasing those out. And all of these areas are where President Trump made promises that he was going to take care of some working people. Well, man, those go away fast. Tax cuts for the rich, they go on for not just the full 10 years, but they keep going, which is why this is a violation of the entire reconciliation process.
So I find two things very interesting. They're saying if something was in the law that they passed in 2017 and it expires, they're pretending it doesn't expire and therefore extending doesn't cost anything. But in their own bill, when they say a provision expires, they're saying, no, it really does die, and therefore we're saving money in the years after. How is those two things possibly consistent?
Well, clearly they're not. I mean, this is literally magical. thinking. This is why Republican Congressman Schweithart called this, or Chip Roy called this fairy dust, and why the congressman from Arizona said this was pure intellectual and economic fraud. That's what it is. That's the bottom line.
Well, I really thank the senator from Maryland also pointing out that President Trump, he did, when he was campaigning, say he was fighting for ordinary families. But at his inauguration, who did he have standing behind him? Not champions for health care or champions for housing, certainly not champions for nutrition or education, but in fact a series of like 5 or 6 billionaires. And now you're telling me that in this bill, and I want to make sure the American people understand this, the provisions that were sweeteners to say we were helping working people are being phased out, but they're keeping all the tax breaks for billionaires.
Well, you're right. It was right down this hall, actually, that President Trump was sworn in, and he said it was going to be a new golden age for working people. Well, as you're pointing out, and this chart clearly shows, and their own budget reveals, it's clearly a golden age for billionaires and people who make a lot of money. And in this bill, they make sure that that golden age for very rich people goes on forever. They had a few little crumbs that they were throwing for a little while, we can see, to others, but just for a little while and just small amounts compared to the golden age for the billionaires.
Well, I must say my impression is, and I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Republicans are embarrassed by the fact that they're proposing a bill that creates over $3 trillion in debt in 10 years and over $30 trillion over 30 years, and that the vast bulk of it goes to billionaires. And so they want to say, we're so embarrassed because we mentioned fiscal responsibility when we were running for office. We were going to get the budget under control, and they're doing the opposite. And they're embarrassed that they're doing these cuts in programs to fund tax breaks for billionaires, cutting regular health care, 16 million people losing health care for tax breaks for billionaires that, as you point out, go on and on and on, actually permanent. I would certainly love to yield to my colleague from Rhode Island.
When I was budget chairman and we were trying to focus, for instance, on the impending economic nightmare coming our way through climate-caused property insurance failures, what I would get is nonstop regular lectures from Republicans on the Budget Committee about how we had to take responsibility for the deficit, we had to reduce the debt, nothing else mattered as much, it was absolutely vital. And now, of course, we see that at their very first shot, with the power to do anything through their majority and using reconciliation, they're raising the debt. They're raising the deficit, and not by little, but by trillions. And I'm wondering if in your time as chairman, or perhaps in Senator Murray's time on the committee, or perhaps in Senator Van Hollen's time over on the House committee, you were favored with such constant lecturing by Republicans about the debt and the deficit, and how credible that all seems right now.
I'll yield to Senator Murray.
I thank the senator for his question, because it's just stunning to me that the vast majority of debate, in fact, all the debate that came from Republicans at the time I was chair of the Budget Committee trying to put forward a smart budget for the United States of America, the only thing they talked about was debt and deficit. The only challenge they made to us was debt and deficit. The only time we tried to do anything for childcare, for health care, they threw the debt at us. So it is pretty stunning to me that now that they need to raise the debt for giving tax breaks to the very rich people who stood behind the president at his inauguration, then they play with the numbers and pretend it's not real, and a trillion all of a sudden becomes zero, and I'm using some rule you've never heard of to try and pretend that this isn't real. It's fairy dust.
I just want to say, to answer the question from the senator from Rhode Island and pick up on what my colleagues have said, that when I was the senior Democrat, the ranking member on the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan was the chairman of the committee. And look, We disagreed on many things. We agreed on many things. We both agreed that we should get our deficits and debt under control. We had different ideas on how to do it. He wanted to privatize Medicare. We wanted to close tax breaks for the rich. But we wanted to close tax breaks for the rich. But the reality is that the holy grail, I mean, the only guiding North Star for Republicans at that time was we've got to bring down deficits and debt. This is not that Republican Party, not in any way, shape, or form. They clearly don't give a damn. In fact, they are worried, as we can see, that the American people still care, which is why they want to engage in this fraudulent scheme. But I'll just close on this. I remember one of those years, I believe it was the 2012 Republican convention. They even put up a debt clock. They put up a debt clock at the convention. I can't find it. Right? I'm looking under my desk for the debt clock here because Republicans seem to have hidden it away forever. They want to wish it away. That's what they're telling us.
But the bill actually is required to raise the debt limit by $5 trillion. So in reality, there's a huge hit to our debt, huge additions to our deficit, and it makes me a little bit frustrated to think back to all those lectures that I had to receive as budget chairman, which the senator from Maryland witnessed as a longtime member of the Senate Budget Committee, which the ranking member witnessed in his time on the Budget Committee, and which Senator Murray experienced when she chaired the Budget Committee. We have been lectured to death by our colleagues, and at the very first instance when they had the power to do something about it, they went 180 the other direction and are cranking the national debt in order to give big benefits to the rich people who fund their campaigns.
For a question, and I know we need to move on here. I just want to add one thing. It's not just that it's going to be debt. It's the cost to families because this debt they are putting in place. I would ask the chair of the Budget Committee now, as he knows as I do, people's houses are going to cost more because their mortgage interest rates are going to go up. Their cars' interest rates are going to go up. This is not just magic numbers sitting out there pretending they're not. Real families are going to feel the cost of this debt and this deficit.
I really appreciate that point from my colleague from Washington State, because in this bill, it creates so much necessitated borrowing that CBO estimates that borrowing will cause interest rates to go up. And when interest rates go up for the Treasury, it goes up on your car loan, on your adjustable rate, a mortgage on your house, and just in general. These are costs that are borne by ordinary families. And I find it very interesting because the Republicans were demanding what they called the dynamic score, saying, well, won't these cuts produce such a great economy that it will kind of lift all boats and produce more revenue, and maybe the deficit won't be as bad. Here's what Congressional Budget Office found. Again, that's the nonpartisan, honest broker numbers. They found that because of the interest rates rising as a result of this massive sea of red ink that necessitates massive borrowing, that in fact those rising interest rates will hurt the economy. So there's no dynamic score that produces, oh, well, it isn't so bad after all. No, it's the opposite. And in fact, that dynamic argument has always been wrong. And we are looking at the folks who lectured, my colleague from Rhode Island, I sat through many of those lectures as well. And I went, in my head, wait a minute, aren't these folks who did the massive ocean of red ink in the 2001 Bush tax bill? Aren't these the same folks that produced a massive ocean of ink in another tax bill 2 years later? Aren't the same ones that in 2017 did a massive ocean of red ink, and now they're doing it again? How could they possibly be putting themselves forward as deficit hawks or debt hawks? Not to mention that they cheered on two adventures that were a huge tragedy for the United States of America, trying to occupy Afghanistan and going to war in Iraq, which together added $8 trillion to our debt. And If you take a look at this chart, every time there is a Republican administration, the last deficit while they're in office compared to their first deficit goes up. For Clinton, it went down. That's fiscal responsibility. For George W. Bush, first term, it went up. For Obama, it went down. In other words, the Democratic presidents, time after time after time, Clinton, Obama, Biden, they reduced the deficits while they were in office. And the Republican presidents, while they were in office, every single time increased the deficits. So none of us want to hear any more talk about fiscal responsibility from across the aisle. You want to be fiscally responsible? Vote no on this bill, because this bill takes and fires 16 million people out of health care to finance those tax breaks for billionaires. This bill says 4 million children will go hungry to finance tax breaks for billionaires. This bill is families lose and billionaires win, and the debt goes up, endangering our ability to do basic programs for the entire next generation. It is wrong on every count. And I think collectively, we urge our colleagues to honor the argument they've made over time, that in fact they were concerned about the deficit. They were concerned about American families. Because if you are concerned about the deficit and debt, if you are concerned about families, you must vote no on this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I really want to thank my colleagues. I mean, you just said they used to call themselves deficit hawks. We need to call them deficit robins. They're robbing from you to pay for the billionaires. They are no longer deficit hawks. Agree? Thank you.
And I think, as Senator Merkley said, if you care about deficit and debt and you don't want working families to have to pay for these tax cuts for billionaires and the rich, vote no on the bill.
I'd only add in my last words, watch. Everybody here, watch as this goes forward, because we will give the Republicans a chance to reduce the increase to the debt and the deficit by peeling back just the tax cuts for the greedy billionaires. We would be voting for working class tax cuts, I'm almost certain. We'll have a chance to bring into stark focus through our amendments what really matters to the folks on the other side of the aisle, and that is the tax cuts for the super wealthy, for the billionaires, for the corporations that are offshoring jobs, and for the biggest polluters in the country. That's where their sweet spot is, and we will expose that through these votes. By peeling back
those votes, we're not sure when they will start, because the Republicans are redrafting provisions of this bill right now. That's how little time this Senate will have to actually know what's in this 1,000-page bill, with all kinds of special deals tucked into it for various members. We will have little time to see, because they're still writing it. So those amendments that my colleague from Rhode Island mentioned, stay tuned. We're not sure if those amendments are going to start at 2 in the morning or if they'll start sometime later tomorrow, but stay tuned and pay attention, because you're going to find out who stands with families and who stands to hurt families in favor of helping billionaires. Thank you.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, thank you. I think it's really important, the discussion we had right now about the deficit and debt, but I want to talk a little bit more about this bill in general. You know, recent KFF polling shows that this Republican big, ugly betrayal bill is overwhelmingly unpopular. In fact, this thing is more underwater than the Titanic. Nearly 2 in 3 Americans view this bill unfavorably. That goes up to nearly 3 in 4 when they learn it will kick millions off their health insurance. And it goes up to nearly 4 in 5 when they learn it will choke off funding to their local hospital. In other words, the more the American people hear about what is actually in this big, ugly betrayal bill, the more they dislike it. So with that in mind, I want to be here today to say a little bit more about what is in the Republicans' latest version. Spoiler alert, it is still big, it is still ugly, and it is an absolute betrayal of the people who sent us here to fight for them. The Republican plan is still going to mean over 16 million people losing health care as patients get kicked off their ACA plans. Kids and struggling families will get kicked off Medicaid. Rural hospitals are going to be forced to shut their doors. The Republican plan is still going to mean more starving families. New red tape is going to cut people off from their SNAP benefits that they need to put food on the table. And it is going to take away kids' school meals. The Republican plan still rips away support from the people in this country who are struggling the most to give away billions in tax breaks to billionaires who need help the least. In short, this latest version of Republicans' bill would still be one of the biggest transfers of wealth from the people at the bottom to the people at the top in our nation's history. When it comes to health care, this Republican abomination will cause millions of people to lose their insurance and see their costs skyrocket in one way or another. It will create mountains of new paperwork and bureaucratic barriers that are positively meant to kick people off their Medicaid and ACA coverage. And there is new sabotage to the ACA healthcare markets, which will mean more people losing their affordable coverage. Meanwhile, there is nothing, a big fat zero, when it comes to renewing the tax credits Democrats passed to lower your healthcare costs. That's right. While Republicans are showering their billionaire donors in new tax breaks, they will not lift a finger to extend healthcare tax credits that are saving millions of families thousands of dollars a year on health coverage. Instead, they're going to make sure people lose health care coverage, including our seniors, people with disabilities, pregnant women, millions of patients who rely on Medicaid. And let's not forget, the cuts in their bill are going to shutter hospitals across the country, especially in our rural areas. Do you have Medicaid, Medicare, employer-sponsored coverage? Regardless, Republicans have some pretty bad news for you, because it hardly matters what insurance you're on when you don't have a hospital to get care anymore. In Washington State, we have 14 rural hospitals that are fighting to survive and would likely close under this bill, mostly in areas represented by Republicans, I should add. Not to mention, we have 6 rural labor and delivery units that could be forced to close their doors under this bill. And you know what the Senate Republicans did? They made that problem worse. They put even more pressure on our rural hospitals.
That are fighting to survive.
This betrayal
and would likely
is
close under this bill,
mostly in areas represented by Republicans, I should add. Republicans want to shut the doors of one of the biggest healthcare
labor and delivery
in
units
the country.
that could be forced to close their doors under this bill.
Planned Parenthood. That is,
you know what the Senate Republicans did? They made that problem worse. They put even more pressure on our rural hospitals.
It would shutter at least 200
is getting
health
bigger
centers that provide a wide
by the day.
spectrum of care,
And
including
this cannot get
cancer
lost.
screenings,
Republicans
pap
want to
smears,
shut the
birth
doors
control
of
for millions of women. And let's not forget, Republicans are cutting nutrition assistance too. This big, ugly betrayal would make one of the biggest cuts to SNAP in history. We are talking around a $200 billion cut over the next 10 years. Now, it should be obvious, but that would be devastating for our country and for our kids' future. And yet, Republicans are not giving up on taking dinner off the table, taking school lunch off kids' trays, all so they can shovel tax cuts at billionaires and wealthy corporations. And it is worth underscoring the new red tape in their bill is even targeted at some of our most vulnerable families, because it expands work requirements to apply to seniors and parents with kids in school. Mr. President, when my dad, World War II veteran, got sick with multiple sclerosis, he lost his job. He lost his job. My mom was at home, 7 kids she was raising. My dad lost his job, and they had to spend, my mom had to spend some time getting some new skills so she could go back to work and take care of our family. You know what, during that time? We had to rely on food stamps in my family to feed those 7 kids in my family. But under this Republican bill today, because neither of my parents had a job during those few months, my family would not be eligible for SNAP benefits. We would not have even gotten food on our table at the worst time in my family's life. This is wrong. Thanks to those food stamps, my family did get through that rough patch. And all 7 of us kids grew up to give back to our communities. Whether it's a firefighter or a middle school teacher or even here as a United States Senator. So I can't emphasize enough. Republicans want to cut families from SNAP and Medicaid, programs that give people a hand up in hard times. Why? So they can give an enormous handout to the richest people and biggest companies in our country. Oh, and at the same time, they're making it harder to afford groceries and health care. I should mention, they are also gutting energy investments in a completely chaotic way that is all but guaranteed to drive away jobs and drive up energy costs for all of American families. And at the same time, in this bill, they're giving billionaires billions of dollars. Republicans are going to give students the short end of the stick. This big mess of a bill would tear away programs and protections that make it possible for many students to pursue a higher education. It eliminates Grad Plus loans. It cuts families off from Parent Plus loans. It punishes students who go into public service or a medical residency, and more. Meanwhile, they are tearing down the guardrails from gutting regulations that protect students whose universities commit fraud, to opening a Pandora's box for Pell Grants with a new loophole that will let low-quality programs suck up our taxpayer dollars. These changes are especially going to hurt students from low-income families and first-generation college students and our veterans. Some of them will have no way to go to college when Republicans take their support away. Some will be driven into predatory private loans they can't afford. And some will get lured into low-quality programs that take their money, waste taxpayer dollars, and leave the student worse off. And if that wasn't enough, if the Secretary of Education wanted to try and stop this kind of fraud and protect students, Republicans will leave them at about as much authority as a school hall monitor. Because in this bill, Republicans prevent any Secretary of Education from making regulations that carry added benefits for borrowers. And it hardly matters if that is a good impact, like saving students money, or protecting taxpayer dollars from fraud, or making higher education more accessible. Republicans are going to make problems worse and make fixing them even harder. Students in this country should be outraged. And I want to be perfectly clear about something. If Republicans charge ahead with this big, awful mess, which they seem intent on doing, they can kiss any last shred of credibility goodbye, as we just talked about, when it comes to pretending they care about balancing the budget or addressing the national debt. The idea was already laughable. For the entirety of the 21st century, the biggest driver of the national debt has been tax cuts that Republicans championed. But now, as we just talked about, they want to put at least $4 trillion, that is trillions with a T, on the national credit card. Why? So they can shower the richest people on the planet with more money. And then they're pretending all the math works and it's kind of easy peasy if they only they can do it if they kick people off health care or take enough meals away from kids or close enough hospitals or better still, use some absurd accounting gimmick to pretend that billions of dollars in new tax cuts for their billionaire donors actually just don't cost anything. Well, I've got some bad news for Republicans. Your math is terrible, and so's this bill. This thing is very expensive, and you don't have to take my word for it. Ask the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which just said the latest version of this bill will add 4 trillion, T-trillion, to the debt with just over the next 10 years. If Republicans want to ignore them, you can also ask the fiscal hawks at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They calculate that the House bill adds $5 trillion to our debt when you include interest payments and the cost of making temporary provisions in this bill permanent. And we are told the Senate bill is even less fiscally responsible. Everyone agrees this thing is not beautiful, but it is recklessly big, and it won't just increase the debt, it will blow it up. Mr. President, this may very well be the most expensive bill in history. I say may because Republicans are still planning changes. We have not yet gotten the final bill. They already cut out even more taxes for multinational corporations. SNAP benefits, they're still on the chopping block. Healthcare, still on the chopping block. In fact, they want to cut Medicaid even more painfully. We may not know how expensive the Republicans will be in the end, but we know who is paying for it. Paying for it is you, working families. And it is important for people to know, as bad as this bill is, Republicans were trying to make it even worse. Now, Democrats have been fighting them every step of the way, and we have notched a few important wins by challenging every single provision we possibly could under the Senate rules. So I want to talk about some of the things Democrats were successful in getting out. Because if Republicans had their way, not only would this bill take away more food from our struggling families or shutter even more hospitals and kick even more people off their health insurance, it would have also sold off all of our public lands. And if instead of just slashing CFPB funding, it would have completely shuttered the doors of a very important federal watchdog that protects Americans from getting scammed. If Republicans had their way, this bill would make it easier to buy gun silencers, harder to get your earned income tax credit or pay off your student loan, and effectively impossible to get insurance plans on the marketplace that cover abortion care. If Republicans had their way, this bill would have also given Trump more power to deny funding to our constituents on a whim and less power for the courts to stop him. We're talking about a whole smorgasbord of really awful, unpopular ideas and policies that would have hurt our families and weakened our democracy. Ideas that were this close to making it into this bill. But Republicans did not have their way. Democrats have been fighting back at every single step. We got those provisions tossed in the shredder, and we are still doing our darndest to send the rest of the bill to the shredder as well. Now, let's be clear. When we talk about how unpopular this bill is with the American people, the reason is simple. This bill polls like garbage because it is garbage. That's why it should go nowhere except a trash bin. Democrats are going to keep pushing back on this monstrosity with absolutely everything we've got at every step we can. We're not going to stand by as Republicans shutter hospitals so the richest people in the country can build another vacation home. We are not going to sit around and let Republicans kick millions of people off of their insurance and raise working families' premiums so corporate executives can get a bigger bonus. And we are not going to be silent as Republicans take food away from struggling families so they can help billionaires fuel up their private jets. We're going to keep speaking up, we're going to keep pushing back, and we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what is going on here. This bill is deeply unpopular, that much is clear, but if Republicans keep pushing for this disaster, buckle up, because we are only going to keep getting louder and louder about how big this is, how ugly it is, and it's only going to get more unpopular with the folks back home as these provisions are enacted if this bill passes. I'm pretty astounded by how far some Republicans are trying to stick their heads in the sand on this. One Republican senator told their concerned constituents, and I quote, "We're all going to die." Well, maybe that's a better name for the bill. At least it's more honest. Because when you take health care away from people, when you make it harder to get, when you make it harder to afford, when you close the only hospital for miles, yeah, you're right, people will die. You'd think my colleagues would show a bit more concern about that. Instead, that senator actually doubled down, and in a response video, she filmed walking through a cemetery. I don't know how you get out of touch that much to misunderstand this, but let me be clear about something to our Republicans. Whistling past the graveyard is a metaphor to stop ignoring dangers. It is not a literal messaging suggestion. And if you thought Republicans couldn't be any more dismissive to their own constituents, this week another Republican senator who was speaking about people voicing their concerns about these Medicaid cuts that said they will, quote, "people will get over it." Mr. President, I have news for every one of my Republican colleagues who is trying to deny the reality of this bill and pretend the fairy tales they are telling themselves are true. When someone's local hospital closes, they don't get over it. When someone's kid is kicked off health care, they do not get over it. And if Republicans don't want to take my word for it, they can listen to the doctor I spoke with who warned when patients go uninsured, they delay care, and it increases costs for everyone. Instead of paying $10 for diabetic medication, we'll pay $10,000 for an amputation. Or Republicans can actually read the countless letters I'm getting from my constituents, sharing their stories. Quote, "My dad is a double amputee. He relies on Medicaid. Without Medicaid, we couldn't get my kids anti-seizure medication." Or, "I'm a full-time caregiver for my daughter with cerebral palsy, or my son with spina bifida, or my elderly mother, and this bill threatens to kick them off their health care and the support services they rely on to survive." Or better yet, Republicans can go out and talk to their own constituents, because I have no doubt they will hear similar stories. They will even come to you. Advocates have been here in D.C. all week. I've seen them in the halls. I've heard them from my office. And now Republicans can listen to the people across the country who are warning them about this bill, and they can do the right thing and abandon this effort. Or they can keep ignoring them. But make no mistake, in the end, the American people will have their voices and their votes heard. Because at the end of the day, this bill, this monstrosity of a bill, is all in the goal of a tax break for multi-billionaires and corporations, and the way they pay for it is by taking away your health care and your nutrition, the things your family or your neighbors or people you know rely on. And that's just wrong. It's un-American, and we're fighting back. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. This monstrosity of a bill is all in the goal of a tax break for multi-billionaires and corporations, and the way they pay for it is by taking away your health care and your nutrition.
Mr. President.
The things your family or your
Senator from Rhode Island.
or people you know.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to oppose this partisan reconciliation bill. Republicans have named it the One Big Beautiful Bill, but you'd only use that kind of title if you were trying to hide something. And here's the simple truth. This bill takes health insurance and food assistance away from millions of Americans and gives President Trump's billionaire and millionaire friends giant tax cuts. And this bill, it would provide hundreds of billions of dollars in tax giveaways to the country's 902 billionaires and millionaires, while kicking 17 million Americans off their health insurance. Just weigh the balance. 902 beneficiaries with extraordinary tax deductions and tax benefits versus denial of health care to 17 million Americans. It doesn't balance. And despite slashing health care, somehow this bill will add trillions of dollars to our national debt. It will further weaken our financial position in the world. It will indeed have many countries wondering if the United States is, as it has been since the end of World War II, the place to put their resources, their investments, their reserves. This could have profound fiscal and monetary implications for the United States. And if you tie that together with this tariff battle, we are headed economically in the wrong direction as we are socially. This bill is loaded with outrageous special interest giveaways and President Trump's personal political priorities. For example, $7.5 billion for wealthy developers to use for luxury housing and other high-priced developments at a time when affordable housing for working families is a crisis in every state in the country. $1.7 billion for gun makers who will be able to sell silencers, sawed-off shotguns, short-barrel rifles, and other very dangerous weapons and components tax-free, making our streets more dangerous for police and for the American people, and indeed, especially for the police, because they're the first responders. They're the ones that are typically going to the door, wondering if the person behind that door has an automatic weapon or some other weapon designed not to hunt or shoot, but to kill. Hundreds of millions of dollars in new tax cuts for extraordinarily wealthy oil and gas companies, and $40 million for a Garden of Heroes, a sculpture garden to honor President Trump's favorite historical personalities. And at the same time, it slashes the budget for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which makes sure that shady payday lenders, mortgage lenders, and banks don't fleece American families. And in particular, the military division of the CFPB protects men and women in the uniform of the United States. We were able to pass an interest cap of 36% for active duty personnel. And that is going to be ignored because there's no one to enforce it. And we are going to see, as we have in the past, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, guardians exploited, systematically exploited by all those little automobile shops and payday lenders and everything else that surrounds every military fort base in this country. It's a tale as old as time. My Republican colleagues showering the rich with tax benefits and prioritizing favored industries and friends. President Bush joined with the Republican Congress to do that. Of course, I opposed it. And well, by the way, when President Bush did that, we were projected to have, over the next 10 years, a multi-trillion-dollar surplus. Of course, this legislation will lead us to a multi-trillion-dollar deficit. And it's interesting because when I was younger, the Republicans all associated themselves with fiscal responsibility, balanced budgets, surpluses. That's not the case. President Trump exacerbated the situation in his first term by his grand giveaway. But this time, President Trump and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are depriving millions of Americans of their health care coverage to pay for it. They are intent on punishing the most vulnerable Americans in this bill, simply for the crime of being poor. In fact, in many cases, despite working very long hours and being poor. I came here to Congress, to the Senate, after serving my country in the U.S. Army, as the President did with great distinction in the United States Navy as a Navy SEAL. I came here to serve my constituents and improve the lives of average Americans. And I think most of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, came with the same goal. And according to press reports, a few of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are starting to realize that this bill is going to do great damage to their constituents. One Republican colleague has warned that this bill could leave 600,000 of his constituents without health care coverage and blow a $38 billion hole in his state's budget. That would be a devastating effect. One of the other aspects of this attack on our health care system is there's some people that believe, well, Medicaid doesn't touch me. It certainly does. Because when you extract that much money from the health care system, what will private health insurance do? They'll raise their rates. Everyone will be paying more. And some won't be able to afford it. They'll have to go without coverage. And that is going to be a tragedy for this country. Now, knowing the damage this bill is going to do, one must ask, why would anyone support this? But this legislation is more than just numbers. I've heard from countless Rhode Islanders who are concerned about these cuts. During meetings, in letters, when I bump into them at the grocery store or the pharmacy, they've been telling me about how Medicaid has helped them and their families. I've been meeting, for example, with Christina from Smithfield, Rhode Island, for many years. Her daughter, Lauren, was born with cystic fibrosis and has endured countless hospitalizations, procedures, medications, and other challenges as she navigates life with this disease. Christina, Lauren, and their family have private insurance, but Medicaid also helps cover the expenses not covered by private insurance for people with serious illnesses who are not able to work. When President Trump and congressional Republicans began proposing these cuts to Medicaid, Christina told me, and I quote, "Lauren was born with CF, a rare genetic progressive disease which affects her lungs, GI, and endocrine systems. I had no idea we carried this gene. When Lauren was born, she spent a month in the hospital. We almost lost her. When she was 5, she contracted a germ that put her in the hospital for a month and almost killed her. Her lung function fell to 70%. At 13, I thought she was going to die. Her hospital stays were every 3 months for 2 weeks with IV treatments. Her lung function fell to 30%. With one of the medicines for CF, she was able to finally get her lung function back to 65% at 23 years old. She still suffers every day. Just trying to breathe is difficult. If she catches the common cold, it could put her in the hospital. She has had a hard time keeping weight on, and her GI is a disaster. She spent hours in the bathroom. She developed CF-related diabetes, which always puts her in danger. Every day is rigorous treatments and medications just to stay alive. It is with the help of the NIH and the FDA that she is still alive. Please do not make these cuts. If Medicaid is cut, when she is 26, 2 years from now, she will have no way to pay for all of her hospitalizations, medications, and treatments. Few could afford to keep her alive. It is this simple. Without Medicaid, she will die. We need your help. Carolina from Central Falls, Rhode Island, shared similar concerns for her daughter. My daughter has special needs, and we rely on Medicaid for her needs. Not having Medicaid would create a sinkhole for us. People with profound autism need lifetime, 24/7 care, As you consider budget cuts, it is important to me as your constituent that you work to ensure that this vulnerable population has access to the critical supports that it needs to survive. I will be looking to you for your courage and leadership. Indeed, and now we're looking across the aisle for courage and leadership to reject this flawed bill. I received an email from one constituent, Wally, in Cranston, Rhode Island. She is a 71-year-old retiree on Medicare. Her husband is 72 with Alzheimer's disease, living in a nursing home under hospice care and relying on Medicaid for his health care. She wrote to me that she was, quote, terrified at all the cuts to programs and services that she and her husband so desperately rely on. Without Medicaid, she wonders if she or her husband would be able to continue receiving care. I also heard from Diane in Coventry, Rhode Island, whose daughter gets life-saving care through Medicaid. Diane said, Medicaid is important to me personally. Medicaid matters to me and my family. My 15-year-old daughter suffered a brain bleed and a stroke at the age of 5. It came out of nowhere and was very unexpected. She has spent a lot of time in the hospital, rehabilitation services, doctor's offices, appointments, etc. over the past almost 10 years. Medicaid allows her to be home and taken care of on a daily basis. Without Medicaid, she would not be able to receive hospital-level care at home. She wouldn't have a wheelchair or any other durable medical equipment. She wouldn't be able to get her life-saving medications or the nourishment she needs through her G-tube. Please, I urge you to save Medicaid, not only for my family, but for millions of others. All of our lives depend on it. Now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may say, we're not going to cut these people's Medicaid. We're just going after the fraudsters, the freeloaders who aren't working. Now, who exactly are these fraudsters and freeloaders? Is it the elderly patient who needs expensive nursing home care? Is it the child with a serious chronic health condition? Should we cut off these people's access to health care because they can't work? They physically cannot work? Or because the constant paperwork work requirements got lost in the shuffle? Let's be clear. If my colleagues were serious about eliminating fraud, they would be providing states with more resources to investigate questionable claims and bad actors. Medicaid coverage is not extravagant. It is a lifeline. If my colleagues were sincere in their claim that these cuts are about protecting the program, quote, for the people who need it the most, as the majority leader has claimed, then they would be investing the so-called savings back into Medicaid instead of blowing it on tax cuts for the well-off. Instead, this bill is cutting funding to states for Medicaid, and states will have no choice but to pick and choose who will get access to care. But don't take my word for it. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimates that this bill will cause nearly 17 million Americans to lose their health insurance. 17 million people. That's not fraud. It's just making it harder for people to get health care. On top of that, even if you're one of the lucky ones who gets to keep your Medicaid, will you still be able to get it? Nursing homes rely on Medicaid. More than 6 in 10 nursing home residents in Rhode Island are on Medicaid. As Medicaid funding is cut, what will nursing homes do? I imagine some will have to close their doors or dramatically reduce the number of beds. So you could be one of these fairly well-to-do Rhode Islanders trying to get mom in the Medicaid home, in the nursing home, I should say, and you're willing to pay, but if it's closed, or there's only 5 beds where there used to be 20, she's going to be where, in my generation, grandparents were, in the living room, in a hospital bed, being cared for in those days, typically by your mother. So this approach to Medicaid is going to touch every aspect of American life. And the same can be said about the community health care centers. Medicaid makes up a huge portion of the operating budget for community health centers, which provide primary, dental, and behavioral care to more than 200,000 Rhode Islanders. That's roughly 1 in 5 Rhode Islanders. It's hard enough to find a doctor now. It will only get harder if a community health center closes its doors and thousands of patients don't have a doctor anymore. And where do all those patients end up when they can't get routine care? The emergency room. That means there will be lines out the door, and if you have a serious health event and need to get in, you better get used to waiting a long time. This is not how a health system is supposed to run. And in Rhode Island, our health system is already on the brink. People are just getting by. People are waiting in the hallways of ERs for a bed upstairs. People are spending days on the phone trying to find a doctor. We should be making these things better, not worse. But again, Republicans' main priority seems not the physical or financial health of everyday Americans. It is providing massive tax cuts to President Trump's billionaire and millionaire friends. There's certainly nothing wrong with being successful, and there's nothing wrong with wealth. That's something that has been part of the American dream since our beginning. But what it requires is opportunity. And one of the fundamental opportunities it requires is good health and good education. And what this bill will do is destroy our health care system and force the states to make dramatic cuts to the education system. We are shutting down opportunity in America while we enrich the wealthy elite. The American dream, as I believe it, is about the middle class and a government that's focused on them, not taking $1 trillion from Medicaid so Republicans can gift to those who've already benefited from many other gifts. Mr. President, let's put the enormity of this transfer to the wealthiest in perspective. There are about 128 million households in America. Yet somehow this bill gives the top 0.1% of households a $250,000 tax cut, a giveaway that's over 3 times larger than what the median American household makes in a year. When confronted with this point, Republicans consistently try to hide the ball. Middle and working class Americans are getting tax cuts too, they say. Who cares if the rich gets richer? Well, the Senate bill raises taxes on the lowest income Americans, the same families from whom Republicans are ripping away health care and other benefits. While we are voting on this bill without a full analysis of its impact on households, the Congressional Budget Office found that the House-passed version would take around $1,600 away from these lowest income households each year, after accounting for tax changes and benefit cuts. And it's not just low-income Americans. Researchers at Penn's Wharton School of Business have found that most Americans lose money under the House bill in future years, too. I want to be crystal clear. We need to reform our tax care system. We need to make it fairer for working Americans, not just for the ultra-wealthy. We hear from people so often that government is broken. They're right. Our tax system is unfair and needs reform. But giving the top 0.1% of Americans an extra $250,000 every year is not fixing the government. It's just adding to the sense of unfairness and brokenness that so many citizens feel. We can do a bipartisan tax bill that is both fully paid for and that helps average Americans. In fact, We almost did that last summer when the House passed a tax bill 357 to 70 that would have extended the child tax credit and reinstated tax cuts for businesses without increasing the deficit. 48 bipartisan senators voted for that bill in this very chamber, but it was blocked because Republican leaders wanted to pass something like this bill before us today. My Republican colleagues have drafted a bill that is neither paid for nor helps most Americans. Worst of all, they have chosen to take from the poor and the middle class and the working class to give to billionaires. This bill is very bad policy. It's almost un-American if you believe that the essence of America, as expressed by one of our greatest presidents, Abraham Lincoln, was to give every person a fair chance in the race of life. This bill denies that chance to millions and millions of Americans while enhancing and filling the pockets of the wealthiest. And I oppose it. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
This bill
Good.
denies that chance.
Thank you. I'm honored to follow my colleague, Senator Reid, and he is absolutely right that this bill is almost un-American. In fact, I would say it is un-American, Mr. President, because it is so destructive to the middle class, to health care, to education, to basic fairness and decency in our great country, the greatest country in the history of the world. It would balloon the debt and the deficit by $4 trillion, and yet my Republican colleagues have sought to disguise and hide that reprehensible pain and damage to the American system. It would cut Medicaid by $930 billion, which means billions in cuts for Connecticut, hundreds of thousands of Connecticut children and families off Medicaid, food nutrition shredded, and student loans decimated. These kinds of impacts on Connecticut are mirrored through the whole country. And the American people are beginning to get it. That's why this bill, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, is so deeply unpopular, in fact, by 2-to-1 majority. And I want to talk not only about Connecticut, but two of the states that are represented by colleagues here. They are so-called red states. But make no mistake, this bill is seismically catastrophic, not just for Connecticut, but for the whole country and for Louisiana, where this measure, if it's passed, will mean that my colleagues from Louisiana are voting to kick roughly 250,000 people in their state off health insurance. They will be voting for a bill that could close 33 rural hospitals in their state alone and cost their state's health care providers $588 million for services that newly insured patients simply will not be able to pay back. Their state program would lose $4 billion. That's Louisiana alone in funding. These numbers are staggering, and they're the reason that every major health system in Louisiana is opposing this bill. Just yesterday, they sent a letter warning that cuts in this bill, and I'm quoting the Louisiana healthcare providers here, quote, would be historic in their devastation and warrant our shared advocacy to protect our patients and the care we provide them in hospitals and clinics. I could go on about Louisiana. I'm going to abbreviate my remarks and put my full statement in the record if there's no objection, Mr. President.
Without objection.
But this bill also reduces SNAP benefits for 206,000 Louisianans. It eliminates the benefit entirely for 94,000 of them. I want to see my colleagues from Louisiana go home and face their constituents, having cut the legs from SNAP and Medicaid programs and many other benefits. And in Utah, same tragic scenario unfolding in a state where 337,000 children and adults depend on Medicaid. Nearly half of all children in Utah are covered by Medicaid. 59% of nursing home residents. 60,000 people living in rural Utah communities covered by Medicaid. If this bill passes, at least 180,000 Utahns will lose health care coverage, and Utah's uninsured rate will increase by a staggering 67%. If this bill passes, 31,000 of the people in Utah could see their benefits slashed, and 13,000 would risk losing their benefits entirely. Now, I just want to say in conclusion, these numbers for Connecticut, for Louisiana, for Utah, for the state of Washington, where my wonderful colleague, Senator Cantwell, will be talking shortly, they're not just numbers. They are faces. They are lives. They're children who are just beginning to be American. And their productivity, their contributions back to America will be hamstrung. Their lives will be financially handicapped. And health-wise, they will be impaired as a result of these irresponsible and reprehensible cuts. I couldn't be angrier about these kinds of cuts in programs done only so that the ultra-wealthy will receive tax cuts. I'm willing to bet that a lot of those billionaires and millionaires would forego those tax benefits if they understood the consequences. But my Republican colleagues, who are in disarray at this moment, they can't come together on a program because they know how abhorrent its effects would be on their states, ought to listen to the people of America, not the ultra-wealthy. And the people are speaking in the polls. They're speaking through their elected representatives, and they are speaking because their conscience simply won't let them support a bill that does such abhorrent damage to the American middle class, the American way of life, American values. And I'm proud to stand here. I wish we weren't here going all night into Monday morning, but I'm proud to stand here with my colleagues. And I just wish my Republican colleagues were on the same sides of these issues, because they're going to go home and they'll have to face the children and families who will be hurt so deeply by this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I rise to ask my colleagues to turn down this legislation in front of us, to reject it, and instead work together on fiscal policy that would help us by growing our economy more successfully and not devastating our constituents. Before I start, I want to thank the presiding officer for speaking up about not selling public lands. I very much appreciate his voice in that debate, and it's critical that we were able to successfully get that out of this legislation. I want to work across the aisle to talk about these policies so that we can move our country forward in a competitive fashion. But I'm afraid that what we have in front of us is not the answer to what will make America competitive, particularly at a time when we are putting tariffs on American imported products, when we are basically getting into a trade war, and when we are devastating what I think is the underpinning of the economy of today, that is an information age innovation economy, and here we are devastating all of our investments in NIH and NSF and in the competitiveness that we just implemented in the IRA and the CHIPS and Science Act that is making us the envy of countries around the world for innovation. We do have great capital markets, and those capital markets help us innovate. And I think some of my colleagues think, well, we have a promise to families here to give them a tax break, and while many of us would support that, you're asking us also to give tax breaks to big corporations before they can get their tax break. And that we don't like. We don't like it because it raises the cost on everybody, and that cost for middle class and lower income people will be devastating, particularly at a time when we continue with this tariff policy. This bill would make the entire healthcare system less responsive and more expensive for everyone by dismantling Medicaid and shifting more of the cost burden onto states and threatening the very existence of rural hospitals. This bill also sells spectrum out from under our national defense and safety agencies and forces states to choose between protecting their citizens from dangerous AI or providing broadband service, and it just gives away big breaks to companies like Meta, that's Facebook, or Google, who I'm sure at this point in time don't really need that additional tax break. Clearly, though, the most egregious and certainly most destructive part of the bill of this reconciliation is the changes to health care. The fact that 17 million people will be uninsured and raise the cost on everyone. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. We don't need to be raising healthcare costs on our constituents. The CBO analysis revealed that hasty negotiated updates by Republicans discussed on behind closed doors early Saturday morning added that $130 billion in Medicaid cuts to the bill. That's a whopping $930 billion in total Medicaid cuts. That is how CBO got to this number of 17 million people. The challenge is nobody marked up a bill in committee. Nobody even had a hearing where somebody presented this information. No, this is all being changed on a daily basis, and everybody's trying to catch up. But what we're really trying to do is fight for our constituents and make sure that we know the impacts. The impacts of these 17 million people will be severe cuts felt in every corner of the United States. State governments will be the first to feel this tsunami of cuts. And unlike the federal government, they must balance their budget, so they can't borrow the money to make up for the deficit. In our state, the state of Washington, our governor and legislators have to grapple with an estimated $3 billion shortfall that this will bring to them as a result of this many people losing coverage. Yesterday, I held a virtual press conference with a group of Republican state representatives. A Republican Utah state representative who, Ray Ward, who just also happens to be a physician, warned that these cuts will amount to $1 billion budget deficit per year in his state of Utah. That budget shortfall forces his state government to make some very difficult decisions. They have to decide whether to cut reimbursements to providers, cut medical services, cut more people off the rolls, or make drastic measures like increasing everyone's taxes. Kevin Leonard and Steve Hobbs, one of them is the executive director of the Association of County Commissioners of North Carolina, and the other, Missouri representative, basically said as county government leaders and state leaders, they are worried that this bill basically is an unfunded mandate on them. Commissioner Hobbs said where they will feel it most is that services like behavioral treatment will now have to be provided through the jails instead of a medical setting. Our own Peninsula Health expert who was on the call basically said that in their region of our state, this could be as much as a 25 to 45% cut in behavioral health. So that's what happens when you cut people off of Medicaid. The amount of money, since Medicaid is 1 in 5 dollars is a Medicaid dollar, you're going to take that much out of the system. These people do not operate on wild, profitable margins, oftentimes barely breaking even, or in behavioral health, oftentimes losing money. But I guarantee you, if instead of seeing this Medicaid population in a behavioral health setting, you think you're going to see them in the emergency room or a jail, it is going to cost us a lot more money. It's going to cost our state, our county, and the local region a lot more money. Not only will this bill diminish their Medicaid revenues, but it will also increase the uncompensated care. Some are estimating to be $42 billion. Our rural hospitals, our rural healthcare challenges will be devastating. In Washington, over 300,000 people will lose health insurance. And these are people who were easily treatable, conditions that if you treat them, chances are they will be dealt with. But now, if you don't treat them, they're going to go to the emergency room and they're going to raise costs on everyone. These families depend on this care. Last week, I spoke on the floor about one of my constituents. Britton Winterrose talked about his daughter Leda, a 5-year-old girl who had a rare condition that when she stopped breathing, she does stop breathing in her sleep if she doesn't have oxygen. Mr. Winterrose talked about how even though he had a very expensive platinum plan, it didn't cover her costs. And just by doing this Medicaid and covering their cost, basically they have saved her life and they have enjoyed her in the many years that they have given to them. Why are we making the Winterroses sweat over whether their daughter is going to be able to keep Medicaid, about whether the whole system in their part of our state is going to be able to keep doing Medicaid? Right now, people are estimating that 5.4 million people will get pushed into medical debt because of health care and the cuts in this bill. The total amount of medical debt that Americans will owe will increase by $50 billion. So is it really worth it to take $880 billion or whatever it is now, $930 billion out of Medicaid so that you're actually increasing the personal debt of people, making counties basically have unsustainable budgets, or having state legislatures come back in to cover our costs? As one of these commissioners said, this is nothing more than cost shifting to the states. It's irresponsible. According to the Center for American Progress, a 60-year-old couple who will be in the affordable care market today, making $85,000 a year, could see their annual premiums raise as much as $15,400. Why? Because when you have uncompensated care and you basically kick people out of Medicaid and off of the Affordable Care Act, what you're going to do is raise premiums on all of us. A low-income Medicare recipient also qualifying for Medicaid could see their costs go up as much as $8,340. So why are we doing this? And the out-of-pocket expenses now that a Medicaid person has to pay for, they could be paying as much as $1,650. You want to do that to give a tax break to Google and Facebook? That's why you're doing this? The tax break that you want to give them, multinationals, and I could just say for a minute about this. You know, when the 2017 tax bill came along and everybody said the corporate rate is too high, we need to have our companies be competitive around the world, I would have considered lowering that rate to something. In fact, my colleague, Senator Kaine from Virginia, proposed something, but we didn't accept that. Instead, they lowered it to a very low rate and then said this year we'll smidge it back up. That means they'll increase it back up a little bit this year. That was their plan. But somehow these multinational corporations have got to my colleagues on this side of the aisle and basically said, give us the same rate that we had in 2017. Now, the reason I didn't support that in 2017 because it was kind of ludicrous. You were saying to companies like Microsoft, we'll give you a tax break. I don't think they really needed that big of a tax break. And but by the way, we're going to raise taxes on the people who work at Microsoft. we are going to raise, because of the SALT deduction, we're going to raise your taxes. So literally hundreds of thousands of people in my state paid higher taxes to do what? Give Microsoft a tax break, which they gave in dividends. Now, did that help our economy? Did that help really grow our economy? I'm pretty sure the innovation at Microsoft helped grow our economy. I'm pretty sure the people who hustled on AI helped grow our economy. I'm sure the investments that we made at agencies across our federal government helped us meet the challenges that we are facing in innovation and competition from China. Not that dividend. But now we're doubling up again. And how much is that multinational tax break? To over $200 billion. So literally, you could take half of that money and you could give it to Medicaid instead and not cut Medicaid. Now let's see. Tax breaks to Meta and Google, or paying for Medicaid. Tax breaks for Facebook and Meta, the same company now changing their name, and Google, or a tax making sure there's enough revenue to pay for Medicaid. This is ludicrous. The notion that we are continuing to make big corporations the priority when they knew this tax extension was not coming. And I'm pretty sure if you look at the numbers that you see from Facebook, Meta, and Google, you will see they don't really need a tax break. They're doing pretty well right now. So the budget reconciliation bill really threatens our progress on health care. Now let me explain what I mean by that. It's not enough to just say that this health care issue, that we are really winning the day. When you look at what happened to us in health care, when our whole goal of doing the Affordable Care Act was to basically get more people covered under insurance. Why? Because we wanted to lower all the costs on health care overall. We wanted health care costs to go down, and we wanted the cost of premiums and the cost to individuals to go down and to be more like the rate of inflation, 3 to 4%. That has been our goal forever, forever. And so prior to the Affordable Care Act, it rates on an annual basis. Think about this, on an annual basis. Your healthcare premiums, your healthcare costs were generally rising about 5.4% a year. Okay, who could keep up with that? Who could keep up with every year your healthcare costs continuing to rise? And so we did the Affordable Care Act, and guess what? We did get that into the rate of inflation. I think there's more we could have done. Lots of things happened in between, but we literally got it down to 3.7%. And we did that by covering more people. The audacity of my colleagues over here to now claim that Medicaid expenses got too expensive, when in reality we made this choice to drive down these premium costs so they were only rising close to inflation, and that was our goal, and we succeeded. So what are we doing now? Well, under the GOP plan, Wakely Healthcare Institute and the Center for Budget Policy, these are numbers that come from them. The GOP plan will now go back to raising your premiums and your healthcare costs between 7 and 11% a year. A year. So we're going to go blowing way past the 5.4. We're going to go back here. And why? Because you're going to cut off millions of people from health care. You're going to increase the cost of uncompensated care. You're going to make people wait to go to emergency rooms, and then they're going to be sicker, and that's going to cost, I don't know how much it costs, but it's definitely a multiple of 5 or more. I don't know if it's, what do you know? What do you think it is, Kevin, at emergency room? 10. Okay, 10. He says 10. It's 10 times more expensive to deal with somebody at an emergency room than just get health insurance and get covered. Okay, so now we want to know, why are we raising the cost on everybody's health insurance, including these plans? Because this side of the aisle basically wants to cut a bunch of people out of a system that lowered the cost of healthcare plans overall and kept it more in the rate of inflation. Why? Why would you want to do this? So it makes no sense, and I hope our colleagues will think long and hard about that. I also think that you could still take the Google Meta tax break for multinationals and pay for $100,000 and cover the Medicaid. You could take another $100,000 from that big tax break, and you could pay for some of the energy tax credits that were so essential to combating the Chinese in what they are doing on the clean energy front. The Chinese firms are doing everything they can to invest and undercut the United States in EV and battery technology. The U.S. is responding aggressively to that. That's why we did the Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, the Inflation Reduction Act, we basically enacted more than 2,000 new clean energy industrial manufacturing jobs, more than 980 private sector jobs, and more than 3.4 million Americans claimed clean energy tax credits that improve their efficiencies. In fact, the Joint Economic Committee estimated that the typical household could save between $460 and $1,000 in annual energy costs, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. But what do we have now? We have President Trump and inflation. We have inflation because of multiple issues, consumers struggling to keep up amid higher prices, mounting debt, and fiscal uncertainty. That's what we have. And so we're reversing the very tax credits that help lower the cost, and we're going to help us be competitive against China and help us succeed as a nation in the one thing that I always think the United States is really great at, and that is innovation. I don't know if it just started with Ben Franklin or many other people along the way, but you give Americans the task and they will do the job. If you give them the education, if you give them the R&D with a university partner, they will get the job done. And so now, don't take my word for it, take Mr. Musk's word for it. The latest Senate draft bill destroys millions of jobs in America and causes immense strategic harm to our country. Utterly insane, destructive. It gives handouts to the industries of the past while severely damaging the industries of the future. Yeah, he said it best. But back to that chart, we were doing the energy because we wanted to diversify, but we also wanted to lower costs, and we wanted to be competitive. Right here it says the vehicle, okay, natural gas, propane. Okay, that's why we were diversifying, because all those things are going up. So, and this bill is not going to help electricity. You're getting rid of the electricity tax credit. So again, instead of helping Meta and helping Google, you could be helping to lower the inflationary cost by making the investments in these tax credits. But Mr. President, there's more in this bill that I don't like. My colleague from Texas is proposing an AI moratorium. He literally wants to stop states from regulating the rollout of autonomous vehicles, like Texas Governor Greg Abbott, who signed a letter last week to regulate how autonomous vehicles are licensed and deployed in Texas. And how do proponents of this moratorium propose to get started? By holding broadband money hostage unless you implement an AI moratorium. Well, I know what the Heritage Foundation said. The Heritage Foundation said that federal AI power grab could end state protection for kids and workers. Again, you are giving states a big, fat bill, and now you're trying to override laws that have been on the books for a long time, protecting consumers from fraud, from abuse, and from protecting, they are there to protect kids, and now you want to get rid of them. So it's no surprise that stakeholders on the right and left oppose this in the bill. They include 17 Republican governors and 40 attorney generals from both Democrats and Republicans. and other organizations ranging from the Heritage Foundation to the Center of American Progress. So anytime you can get the Center for American Progress and the Heritage Foundation on the same side of an issue, chances are you should be listening to what they have to say. But Mr. President, this letter, I would like to enter into the record from the National Association of Attorney Generals.
Without objection.
This bill would affect hundreds, I'm quoting now from this letter, quote, this bill would affect hundreds of existing and pending state laws passed and considered by both Republican and Democratic state legislatures. Some existing laws have been on the books for many years, end quote. Okay, so these are attorney generals from a variety of states who basically know the laws on their books, and they're basically saying, don't do this to us. Don't override our laws. So I'd also like to enter into the record, Mr. President, a letter from 17 Republican governors also against this provision.
Without objection.
Their letter, I'd like to read from, is really about this point I was trying to make about fighting China. I mean, I thought we were here to be competitive against them, to basically beat them in a race on innovation, just like we did with chips and science to try to move for the future. But basically, their letter says, quote, we fully recognize that AI is dominant in the next industrial competition between the United States and adversaries like Communist China. States have led anti-Communist China action, banning Chinese affiliated companies from owning farmland and property critical for infrastructure and military bases. But America should not sacrifice the health and safety and prosperity of its people in this fight. We must curb AI's worst excesses while also encouraging growth, which is exactly what states have done through their creation of their own regulatory framework, end quote. So they're basically saying the states are on the front lines of helping to protect on AI. Now, Mr. President, I have no idea why the President of the United States has not protected the American people or the American military from the Chinese scams that are happening on TikTok. No, we would never let China own ABC News and put out Chinese communist propaganda on ABC News. But we let them do that on TikTok. This body and our colleagues said, no, stop that and stop the Chinese. And yet we still haven't stopped the Chinese. So now, here we are in this bill, cutting out the state's abilities to fight Chinese AI companies like DeepSeek or Alibaba, and they have no interest in stopping the scammers from using their AI products to harm Americans. They have none. And if you think we're going to pass something here, I'm always ready to sign up to get legislation done. But that isn't going to happen anytime soon. And so now you're telling these governors, these attorney generals, yep, I'm not even going to let you fight China because I'm going to take that tool away from you. So clearly, I don't support this part of the legislation, and I appreciate my colleague from Tennessee and her attorney general working on this very important issue. And finally, I come to the issue of spectrum. This is a very ill-conceived plan to auction off our precious spectrum. Such an auction will fundamentally compromise our defense capabilities while endangering aviation and important federal capabilities like weather forecasting and scientific research. This bill would require the FAA would require an auction of 800 megahertz of spectrum critical to our military and civilian infrastructure. It would compromise military radio frequencies and weather and other spectrum issues. Most importantly, drone operations. And I know the presiding officer knows how much drones are now at the epicenter and forefront of warfare and is reshaping the battlefields across the globe. So why would we do this? Well, my colleague, Senator Cruz, is pushing for something that experts say would risk military operations. Last Congress, we got the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce to agree that we should test bed the next generation of technology because we don't like interference. Now, I'm sure most Americans sitting at home thinking, what is she talking about? Well, if you drive in a car and you have a radio station, and all of a sudden the radio station doesn't get its signal or has some interference, you know that there is an issue. The tower, not big enough, not strong enough. This is the same. This radio spectrum has been used by Department of Defense for secure purposes, very important secure purposes. Mr. President, think of the Chinese balloon and the fact that we want to detect when a Chinese balloon is flying through our airspace. We want to be able to stop people from spying on the United States of America. And yet, instead of basically saying, we are going to look at this military spectrum and make sure that it continues to be secure, my colleague is suggesting to all of us that we sell that and basically allow, I believe, for what is going to be a good amount of interference without solving this problem first. Why does that bother me? Because I think we live in a world where you're going to see more and more spectrum, more and more warfare based on satellite and communication, and the landscape is changing. So I certainly don't want our military preparedness to be affected. Air Force leaders warned that spectrum bands are crucial to this radar operations, and I'm not going to go into more about why, but I'm just saying, just like you can't have 4 radio stations basically interfering with each other, my colleagues want to allow the major telcos, mostly AT&T and Verizon, who are so hungry to sell more, whatever it is, $79.99 plans, $59.99 plans. They literally are going to give away national security just so they can sell more telephone plans. In fact, I would ask them, what have you done to clean up the last disaster that you had when the Chinese hacked you on Salt Typhoon? Now, they didn't successfully hack the telecom company in my state because they were smart enough to do all the preparatory work not to be hacked. But these guys didn't do the work, and now they're up here pushing our colleagues to say, give us more, give us more, give us more, without doing the homework required to figure out how to make sure our military is protected. But what's even more infuriating is they want the same spectrum from our airlines as well. They want to cause confusion between the spectrum of aviation and in this telecommunication. Last time the Trump administration did this, there was a major, major debate, and the White House and the Biden administration had to come in and fix it. It's all related to the altimeter on a plane. Again, the presiding officer knows this well. An altimeter helps tell the plane what altitude they're at and what to do. But if you have interference with that altimeter, as we just saw in this helicopter accident, we're pretty sure now that this accident between an American plane, regional jet, and an Air Force helicopter, there were some altimeter issues, and that caused a discrepancy and a crash. So I am not for any interference with an aviation altimeter. I'm not for it. But instead of figuring this out, working together, both commercial and defense, we're jamming into a bill the overriding of the defense interests and saying just give it to these 2 commercial bidders, maybe more, who then will basically just be empowered to sell more of these telco plans. Mr. President, our competitiveness is too important. Our effectiveness is too important. Collaboration and working together to solve these problems is how the United States is going to succeed. Basically, trying to pit each other against each other in these kind of technology issues is not going to help us win. So, Mr. President, I've outlined many issues here, and I've outlined how you could fund Medicaid without basically doing what we are doing here. There is no reason. According to the Penn-Wharton budget model and analysis, families in the first 40% of earners are on average projected to experience losses in after-tax income and benefit transfers. In other words, Mr. President, yes, extending the 2017 tax cuts does help some middle-class families, and we would support that. But all the hits in other areas, like health insurance, mean they will actually lose money overall. The lowest 20% of income brackets are hit even harder. So in this massive bill, it is those who can least afford it who are going to be hit the hardest. We don't need the Trump inflation. We need to protect health care. We need to make progress in America's competitiveness, but this is not the answer, and I encourage my colleagues to vote against it. I thank the President, and I yield the floor. We don't need the Trump inflation. We need to protect health care. We need to make progress in America's competitiveness.
Senator from Vermont.
This is not the answer, and I encourage my colleagues
Mr. President,
to vote against it. I thank the President, and I yield
President Trump's so-called big, beautiful bill, now on the floor of the Senate, is the most dangerous piece of legislation in the modern history of our country. It is a gift to the billionaire class while causing massive pain for low-income and working-class Americans. Actually, though, Mr. President, I'm wrong. This is not a gift to the billionaire class. They paid for it. This bill is an absolute reflection of a corrupt campaign finance system which allows billionaires to buy elections. And when billionaires spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to elect a president or a senator or a member of Congress, they're not making that investment just for the fun of it. They want something in return, and this legislation, big time, is what they are getting in return. So what is in this bill that they invested in? Well, if you are in the top 1%, you and the class you represent will receive a $975 billion tax break. $975 billion tax break at a time when the richest people in this country have never, ever had it so good. Further, this is really quite unbelievable. If you are among the wealthiest 0.2%, not talking about 1%, talking about the top 0.2%, you will be able to pay zero taxes on your $30 million inheritance. So all of you folks out there who are waiting to inherit at least $30 million, today is a good day for you. Collectively, you will receive approximately $211 billion in tax breaks for the top 0.2%. Congratulations, you hit the jackpot. If you are a large corporation and you want to throw workers out on the street and replace them with artificial intelligence, or maybe you want to shift your profits to the Cayman Islands or other tax havens, you are going to get a $918 billion tax break. Congratulations to the CEOs of large, profitable corporations. But while the rich and large corporations make out like bandits in this bill, what does it do for low-income and working families? Well, let me say a few words on that. If you are concerned about health care, which I suspect that everybody in the world is, this bill throws over 16 million people off the health insurance they have, according to the Congressional Budget Office, by cutting Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act by over $1.1 trillion. In other words, the top 1% getting a $975 billion tax break, and that is coming directly by throwing 16 million people off of the health insurance they have. This bill, for the first time, forces millions of Medicaid recipients who make as little as $16,000 a year to pay a $35 copayment every time they visit a doctor's office. So what is the impact of all of that? You throw 16 million people off health care. You charge force people who don't have any money pay a $35 copayment. So what's the impact of it? Well, this is not my view. This is what the Yale School of Public Health and the University of Pennsylvania determined based on a study that they did. And this is the result. And it is almost so horrific, so grotesque, that it is difficult to speak about. But they estimate that if this bill goes through with all of these cuts in health care, if 16 million people are thrown off of the insurance they have, over 50,000 Americans will die unnecessarily every year. 50,000 Americans will die unnecessarily in order to give tax breaks to billionaires who don't need them. In other words, this bill is literally a death sentence for low-income and working-class people. Further, if this legislation is enacted, rural hospitals all over the country, and I come from one of the most rural states in America, rural hospitals are already struggling. But when you make massive cuts to Medicaid, many of them are going to shut down or not be able to provide the level of services they do today. In other words, this bill would be a disaster for rural America. It would also make massive cuts to community health centers and nursing homes who are very heavily dependent upon Medicaid funding. Bottom line is that this legislation is the most significant attack on the health care needs of the American people in our country's history. We already have, as everybody knows, a health care system which is broken, which is dysfunctional, and instead of addressing it, instead of doing what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people, we are throwing 16 million people off the health insurance that they have. But it's not just health care. The future of America rests with our children. And yet, in a nation which now has the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth, this bill wipes out nutrition assistance for millions of hungry kids in America. We are literally taking food out of the mouths of hungry kids to give tax breaks to Mr. Bezos and Mr. Musk and Mr. Zuckerberg and the other multi-billionaires. If we understand that if we're going to compete effectively in the global economy, we need to have the best education system in the world, this bill makes $350 billion in cuts in education, with the result that working-class kids will find it much harder to get the higher education they need to succeed in life. If you are concerned about the existential threat of climate change, and we're seeing heat waves right now all over the world, this bill decimates investments in energy efficiency and sustainable energy like wind and solar, and moves us in exactly the wrong direction with regard to energy. If you are concerned about our role in never-ending wars, this bill makes a bad situation even worse by handing out another $150 billion to the Pentagon, a 15% increase in an already bloated Pentagon budget. We don't have enough money to feed hungry children. We don't have enough money to make sure that people continue to have the health care that they need. Don't have enough money to make sure the kids can get a decent education. But somehow the military-industrial complex is going to get another $150 billion, 15% increase. Mr. President, in my view, nobody in the Senate or the House should vote for this legislation, and I applaud all of the Democrats for voting against it, and I want to congratulate two Republicans, Senator Paul and Senator Tillis, for voting against it for different reasons, by the way, than I have. But I do find it interesting, and it does tell us where we are as a nation today, that when one of those senators, Senator Tillis, voted against it because he thought it was not a good bill for the people of his home state, North Carolina, suddenly the President of the United States went after him in a very, very vicious way. And today he announced that he will not be seeking re-election. So it appears now that the Republican Party has really become a party of the cult of the individual. The only thing you have to do now as a Republican is say, I agree with President Trump. I love President Trump. President Trump is right all of the time. Hey, it's all you got to do now to be a good Republican. There was a day when Republicans and Democrats understood that they were elected by their constituents. Yeah, you want to work with the president of your own party, nothing to do about that. But there was an understanding that you were also elected to represent your constituents and not simply pay homage and bow down to every wish and whim of the president. Mr. President, during the vote-a-rama, I will be offering several amendments, which I hope will win support. Number one, at a time when 22% of our nation's seniors are trying to survive on less than $15,000 a year, my First Amendment would fundamentally improve their lives in two significant ways. Number one, it would cut the price of prescription drugs under Medicare in half by making sure that our nation's seniors do not pay any more than Europeans or Canadians pay for the same exact drugs. And number two, with those savings, we're going to expand Medicare to cover dental, vision, and hearing. In other words, instead of throwing people off of health care, we're going to expand Medicare to provide a number of services that seniors desperately need and want. Secondly, Mr. President, at a time of massive income and wealth inequality, my Second Amendment would eliminate the $211 billion estate tax for the top 0.2% that is included in this bill. They get a top 2%, as I mentioned, $211 billion tax rate. That is insane. We're going to get rid of that. And lastly, at a time when we spend more on the military than the next 9 nations combined, at a time when the Pentagon cannot account for trillions of dollars in assets, we are going to end the provision that allows the Pentagon to receive another $150 billion. Bottom line, Mr. President, is this country faces many crises: high rate of childhood poverty, kids going hungry, education system in deep trouble, healthcare system completely broken. And in virtually every single area, this bill takes us in precisely the wrong direction. When the wealthiest people in this country have never, ever had it so good, it is totally insane to be offering them $1 trillion in tax breaks so that we can cut health care, education, and nutrition. This bill is not what the American people want, and I hope very much we can defeat it. Thank you very much, Mr. President. $1 trillion in tax breaks so that we can cut health care, education, and nutrition.
The Sergeant of Arms will restore order. The Sergeant of Arms will restore order in the galley. The Sergeant of Arms will restore order. The Sergeant of Arms will restore order in the galley. Sergeant of Arms will restore order in the galley. The Sergeant of Arms will restore order. The Sergeant of Arms will restore order in the galley. Sergeant of Arms will restore order in the galley. The Democratic leader.
Mr. President, I thank my colleagues for coming to the floor. Wait, we'll put this up when we begin. Okay. We'll leave it up. All right.
The Democratic leader.
I thank my colleagues for coming to the floor all day today. I thank them for speaking so fiercely, so clearly about what's at stake for the country. And the American people deserve to see this debate. That's why we last night forced a reading of the bill. Republicans don't want people to know what's in the bill. They want to hide it. They know it's not popular. We all know it's not popular. We all know it's totally against what people want. But a small cabal of very wealthy people and hard MAGA people run that show to the detriment of the party itself and, of course, to the American people. So we forced a reading of the bill last night and allowed people to catch up because the bill was just put on the floor right before the reading started, the amended bill. So we're here today to continue to shine a light on how bad this bill is. And this debate will continue. Soon we'll turn to Vote-A-Rama and bring amendment after amendment after amendment to the floor, so Republicans can defend their billionaire tax cuts, so they can try to explain their massive cuts to Medicaid to people back home, why kids who need health care shouldn't get it so there can be tax breaks for billionaires, why middle-class families who have someone in a nursing home who's now going to be removed from that nursing home because it's going to close, what they're going to do, and to try and to sell to parents and kids why they're making unprecedented cuts to SNAP. Taking food from hungry babies for a tax cut for wealthy people? What kind of world do these Republicans live in? It's a slanted world. It's really a corrupt world. Kids will get $5 a day to feed themselves. You can't buy a dozen eggs for $5. And then they're killing millions of good-paying jobs. It's estimated, and by the way, the clean energy cuts are even worse. Before this, it was estimated 850,000 jobs would be lost in America on clean energy alone. You can't buy a dozen eggs for $5. Over 1 million jobs in health care. 2 million jobs approximately lost. At least 2 million lost because of this bill. That could create a recession. On clean energy alone. So this has been a long few days in the Senate, but the hardest choices for Republicans are still in front of them. Because we know that so many of our colleagues on the other side aren't happy with this bill. Tillis is not an exception. There are many others who think the same way he does. Well, they ought to vote their principles, their conscience, and what's good for their constituencies. Our side is going to give our Republican colleagues a chance to do the right thing in front of this chamber and in front of this nation. The American people deserve to know exactly what's happening right now in the United States Senate. Because right now, Republicans are concocting the ultimate rush job. They're trying to pull off a sneak attack on this chamber and on the American people themselves. The bill before the Senate is utter poison. Some Republicans are trying to rush through a bill that they released less than 2 days ago under the cloak of darkness, written behind closed doors, molded in order to appease Donald Trump and the very special, powerful interests. Earlier today, my colleague from South Carolina came to the floor with a pretty interesting-looking floor chart, where he claimed that his bill somehow reduced the debt by $500 billion. What a joke. The budget chair respectfully needs to check his math, because came to the floor with a pretty interesting-looking floor chart. Somehow, Lindsey Graham, the chairman of the Budget Committee, said that his bill reduces the debt by $500 billion. the budget chair, respectfully, check your math, Chairman Graham, because not 1 hour ago, the JCT confirmed this bill does not reduce the debt, it explodes it. It explodes it. That's what it does. Here's what his chart should have looked like. $4.45 trillion deficit explosion. According to the JCT, the Republican bill explodes the debt by $4.5 trillion. As this chart, drawn slightly better than Lindsay's, shows. For those keeping score at home, my colleague got his math wrong by a whopping $4 trillion. All this, just so billionaires are rewarded while millions lose their health care break. $4.5 trillion deficit explosion. And that's not just an abstract concept. What does that mean? The average American will pay more to buy a home. The average American will pay more to buy a car. The average American will pay more on their credit card debt, on issue after issue after issue. Prices will go up because of this deficit, because of taxes for the billionaire. That's $4.45 trillion. Also, some people, wealthy people, God bless them, they made a lot of money, okay. They don't need a tax break. Prices will go up because of this deficit. Let it be known that this bill is the death knell of the supposed party of fiscal responsibility. We always knew that this was a sham, and now this bill ends the charade of Republicans caring about the debt for all time coming. When they say they have to cut health care on any bill or food stamps on any bill because it reduces the deficit, we will know it's utter hogwash because of $4.5 trillion they're doing now for tax breaks for the wealthy. So, Republicans want to move quickly. That's why we're here on the weekend. That's why they released a bill in the dead of the night, all because they want to hide the truth from the American people. You know, it's hard to believe, my colleagues, this bill is worse, even worse, than any draft we have seen thus far. Every time the bill comes to the floor, a new bill, a new amendment, the hard right handful over on the Republican side, we're not voting for it unless you hurt kids more, you hurt people who need health care more, you hurt rural hospitals more, you hurt clean energy more. And the Republican leadership folds and does it. And the more mainstream, the handful of more mainstream Republicans who know how bad this is right now haven't had the backbone to oppose those changes. We hope they find them. So, this bill is worse on health care, worse on SNAP. It'll kill 900,000 good-paying jobs in clean energy. Folks, you don't like paying your electricity bills? We hope they find them. You'll pay 10% more on your electric bills because of this big, ugly betrayal. It'll also kill 1 million health care jobs. You put it all together, and there's no other way to put it. At the very last minute, the Senate Republicans made the bill more extreme to cater to the radicals in the House and the Senate. Big, ugly betrayal. Republicans want to hide the truth so badly, in fact, that they're even ready to blow up the Senate rules to get it done. Senate Republicans are doing something that has never been done before in this chamber. Never. By Democrats or Republicans, using fake math and budgetary hocus pocus to make it seem like a gargantuan tax break for billionaires is going to cost virtually nothing. That's insane. It's delusional. Current policy baseline doesn't take into account that our actual budget numbers show these cuts expiring. So when you put them back up again, the deficit increases. It's simple math, second-grade math. That's insane. It's delusional. But our colleagues, just again, in a frenzy to help the billionaires, are willing even to do that. Republicans know it. That's why they're squirming. You can see sort of the faces come on the floor. They don't look very happy because they know how bad this stuff is. And they can use whatever budgetary gimmicks they want. Republicans can use whatever budgetary gimmicks they want to make their math work on paper. But you can't paper over the real consequences of adding trillions and trillions to the debt in one fell swoop. And CBO, nonpartisan, everyone who looks at this says it's going to increase the deficit. Not the so-called party of deficit hawks. That's out the window. So, what's going to happen when they pass this bill, if they do? Hope they don't. Our children and grandchildren are going to be faced with a lifetime of higher borrowing costs. As I said, mortgage costs, costs to buy a car, costs for a credit card, harder to start a business. Every one of these will get worse. And the economic ceiling of this country will close in on itself. The economic engine that's been the driver of American innovation and growth and optimism for so many generations will sputter and ossify with this $4.45 trillion deficit explosion. The economic ceiling of this country will close in on itself. It's deeply irresponsible to future generations, to our children, to our grandchildren, to pass this bill. And that's not just members on this side of the aisle saying it. Independent experts across the political spectrum, many of them very conservative Republicans, but who are at least honest about what they're doing, say it too. And plenty of Republicans in both the House and Senate have said it. It remains to be seen if their words and their actions will align. And the question is asked, has to be asked, why is this even happening? Why is this nightmare of a bill moving forward? Why are Republicans forcing our country down this ruinous road when they know the fiscal harms, when they know this is a rush job? Well, we know by now. Tax cuts to billionaires and corporate special interests. And not just another round, but in fact, they make them permanent. Our children, our grandchildren are going to be saddled with these cuts so that a handful of billionaires get a big break, while working people lose their Medicaid, while hungry kids lose access to food funding, while clean energy jobs that support so many Republican communities are taken away. I'd say to my Republican friends, when that plant that makes batteries or wind or solar, or the person who's employing hundreds of people to put panels on people's roofs all fold, and the people lose their jobs, so many Republican communities are taken away. Don't shrug your shoulders and say, I don't know why that happened. You made it happen with a nasty bill. It just makes no sense. We need more energy, AI. Everyone says we need more energy. And to take away the cheapest, quickest way to put more electrons on the grid, solar, makes no sense, except we know Donald Trump has an irrational, infantile mania against clean energy. So they all listen to him. Makes no sense. Way to put more electrons on the grid, solar, makes no sense. This bill has an irrational sabotaging of America. It's the sabotaging of America. It's antithetical to what the country needs. It's antithetical to what the American people demanded last fall. And our Republican colleagues don't even want to tell the American people the truth. That's why Democrats are here on the floor today, sounding the alarm, setting the record straight. I also must say this. The way this bill is being passed so deeply violates the spirit of the Senate. The majority forgets that this chamber is unlike any other institution in government. It's meant to facilitate debate, careful consideration, sound judgment, honest numbers. I also must say this. We're supposed to resist the passions of the radical extreme. We're supposed to hold the line against policies that will devastate our country. We're supposed to resist the gravitational pull of extremists like Donald Trump, who gets these little bugaboos in his head and then wrecks America because of it, and they all go along. We're supposed to hold the line. Senate Republicans are turning their back on the Senate's long-standing tradition of debate deliberation. By rushing this bill, by upending the rule of the chamber, by engaging in what amounts to accounting magic to hide the cost of their bill, Republicans, simply put, are accelerating the erosion of the Senate to the nth degree. Senate Republicans are turning their back on what makes this institution great. More importantly, they're turning their back on the people, their own constituents, in their own communities. People struggling to afford going to see a doctor. You have a child with cancer and you don't have health care? How can we put people in that position? Or families who have to choose between paying for groceries or paying for prescription drug costs, or families who are watching their electricity bills go up and up. Families who are paying more and more costs. This bill, America, you don't want to pay higher costs? We don't want you to on our side of the aisle. The Republicans are making it happen. You will pay more and more and more. Or families who are watching their electricity bills go up and up. And about the future, they're not worried about our kids' livelihood. They're not worried that kids won't be able to find good-paying jobs. The families are worried about the future of this country. They're not worried about our kids' livelihood. But the Republicans are not. They're not worried that kids won't be. And they're worried. Americans are worried about the continued radicalization of leaders in government. And here's the shining example. So the bill is the wrong answer for the American people. By every objective standard, it's deeply irresponsible. It's not only a violation of how the Senate's supposed to work, it's a violation of the promises that Republicans and Donald Trump, when they campaigned, made to the American people to look after their issues, not those at the very top. So I implore my Republican colleagues, there is still time. Abandon these terrible policies. And Donald Trump will continue to have this debate in a real way, not jamming it through in the dark of night. So I implore my Democratic colleagues and I will continue exposing the truth. And if Republicans go down that road, we will continue to make sure today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, that the American people know exactly what happened here. I assure my Republican colleagues, I assure them this vote will not be forgotten. Their betrayal will not go unanswered. This bill must not stand. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Mr. Leader, for setting the record straight. It's really awful when we hear Republicans come down here and they just don't tell the truth about the bill that they are trying to pass. Maybe that's why they try to pass it in the middle of the night. They think no one will really notice.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I will.
Senator, yield. All you have to do is look at their faces. They know that what they're doing. They know it's unpopular. They know they're, as Senator Murkowski said, that they're all afraid. But it's time for them to stand up, isn't it?
Yep. So on Friday, I met Vivian. Vivian is an 11-year-old kid from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Vivian likes school, she likes her friends, she likes reading Harry Potter. She is a lot like any other 11-year-old. But for Vivi, going to school and being with her friends depends on Medicaid, because Medicaid covers the cost for her wheelchair, for her therapists, and for her health aid. Right now, Republicans are trying to rip away health care from kids like Vivian. The cruelty is truly breathtaking. I ask for one Republican senator, just one Republican senator, who plans to vote for this bill, to look into Vivi's eyes and tell her that her health care is just not a priority for this country. You know, Mitch McConnell said to Republican senators that he knew they were getting calls about Medicaid, but not to worry about people losing their care because, according to Mitch McConnell, they will get over it. So I ask the Republican senators to look at Vivi and Vivi's sisters and Vivi's mom and Vivi's dad and say, if Vivi loses her Medicaid and her wheelchair and her therapists and her health aid, tell all of them that they will get over it. Because here's the deal. Vivi won't get over it. Her family won't get over it. The people of North Carolina won't get over it. None of us, Massachusetts, Idaho, Louisiana, none of us will get over it. The cruelty here is off the charts. But the part that really burns is the Republicans are trying to slash the health care that keeps kids like Vivi alive so they can hand out more tax cuts for billionaires. It is beyond cruel. It is obscene. I am angry, and we should all be angry. Because instead of playing at the pool at the park like a regular kid on summer break, Vivian had to come here to Washington to beg senators not to cut her health care. In a country as rich as ours, that shouldn't even be a question. Now, I actually don't think that my Republican colleagues have lost their hearts. They have lost their spines. It seems that all they can do now is bow down to Donald Trump and his billionaire donors. They will bow down, even if it means hurting families, community hospitals, and nursing homes in their own states. Trump wants the Republicans in Congress to hand out giant checks to the wealthiest Americans and the biggest corporations, and the Republican senators are willing to do that, even if it means kicking Vivi to the curb. Republicans know what they're doing. They know that this bill will hurt people. They know that this bill will kill people. And though it's hard to believe, they just look the other way. But on behalf of Vivi and millions of other kids and mamas and seniors and families that rely on the life-saving care that Medicaid makes possible, my Republican colleagues should grow a spine and stop this awful bill in its tracks. If it wasn't bad enough that this bill is set to rip away health care from 17 million Americans to pay for tax giveaways for billionaires, it actually has a bunch of other filthy giveaways buried in it, too. Who wins if Republicans pass this big, ugly bill? Billionaires, Wall Street, big tech, big oil, the wealthiest Americans, and the biggest corporations. Big oil will get a special get out of paying your taxes card, while millions of people lose their health care coverage. Billions of dollars for big oil, nothing for Vivi. Meta, oh man, Meta, there's a company that's really struggling. Meta will win $15 billion to incentivize them to do research in 2022, 2023, and 2024. Think about that. Unless a time machine comes with this, what Meta does in those 3 years is already done. But under this bill, Meta gets a $15 billion check on the day this bill passes, simply for existing, while families lose access to their health care. Wall Street wins big with a provision Republicans squeezed in that would slash funding for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Giant corporations want the opportunity to cheat American families again. So Republicans are desperately trying to take the cop off the beat. And who loses thanks to this big, ugly bill? Americans who can't afford health care. Families who need a little extra help putting food on the table. Grandmas and grandpas in nursing homes. Little babies and their mamas. If Republicans pass this bill, 17 million Americans will have their health care ripped away. That number has kept growing as the Republicans keep making more and more changes to the bill. For them, it is just a question of how many more Americans they can rip away health care from. This bill would also make the biggest cut to food assistance for families, kids, and veterans in American history. And here's one to underscore. 1 out of every 4 nursing homes in America would have to shut down under this bill. You know, my Republican colleagues should just call a few seniors who are in nursing homes in their home states and just go over the plans for where those folks are supposed to go next. What exactly do the Republicans have in mind for them? Maybe call the daughter of someone who's in one of those nursing homes and explain how she has to become a full-time caregiver once this bill passes. Maybe call just a few of the people whose lives you plan to tear apart. Budgets are about our values, and Republicans have made their values clear. They are willing to throw millions of Americans under the bus so that they can help out a handful of their billionaire buddies and giant corporations. They should be ashamed. Here's what Democrats believe. Democrats believe that no baby should go hungry so that Mark Zuckerberg can buy another Hawaiian island. Democrats believe that no person with a disability who needs a wheelchair or a home health aide to live independently should have to give that up so that Jeff Bezos can buy a 3rd yacht. And Democrats believe that no grandma should be pushed out of her nursing home so that Elon Musk can take a subsidized rocket ship ride to Mars. It doesn't have to be this way. What if, instead of tax breaks for billionaires, we make the rich pay their fair share? What if, instead of slashing health care for our kids, we make it possible for every American to see a doctor when they're sick without breaking the bank? And what if, instead of giving big oil more giant handouts, we make universal child care a reality for families all across this country? We can tax the rich. Damn it, if Jeff Bezos can afford to rent Venice for $50 million for his wedding, he can afford to pitch in his fair share on taxes so the next kid has a chance to make it big, and the kid after that, and the kid after that. We can make life better for working people. We can make it easier, not harder. We can lower costs for families, not jack them up even more like this bill does. We can put families first, not billionaires and billionaire corporations. Democrats believe this. Democrats are willing to fight for this. We will vote no on this awful bill. And for kids like Vivian, for seniors in nursing homes, for families who rely on home health aides, and for the millions more Americans that this bill will hurt, I urge my Republican colleagues, grow a spine and vote no. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. And for the millions more Americans.
Senator from Oregon.
President, before she leaves the floor, I want to thank my colleague in particular for putting a human face on what this is all about for us on this side of the aisle. That small child, the senior you were talking about. I'm going to pick up on what you said, and I thank you for your leadership. Mr. President, I'm going to get into the specifics of this horrifying bill in a moment, all the details of the healthcare carnage and the clean energy bloodbath that Republicans are dragging America toward. First, though, I want to spend just a few minutes on the state of the Senate and our democracy. As of a few hours ago, the rules of the Senate are whatever Republicans feel like when the day begins. It's democracy defined, plain and simple. The bill before the Senate is loaded with fraudulent budget math that hides trillions of dollars in handouts to corporations and the ultra-wealthy. It's a violation of the rules that used to be followed for years for the reconciliation process.
It's a violation of the Congressional Budget Act. It's a violation of common sense. Republicans decided that none of that matters, so they've kind of gone nuclear to advance the bill. Apparently in this chamber, if the Republican chair of the Budget Committee says so, 1 + 1 = 3. That is unsustainable. We are going to be a sicker, poorer, and weaker country if this bill becomes law, and the Republicans have used this process, going nuclear, to pass it. But these moves cut both ways, and there'll be a lot of cleanup for Democrats to handle down the road. Now, in my time in public service, Mr. President, I have never seen a more destructive, regressive, common sense-defying bill debated in the Senate. This bill is going to determine the future of health care in America. Millions of Americans will lose their health insurance if Republicans pass the bill. My colleagues seem to be ignoring, for example, the fact that rural hospitals are the anchor of life in much of America. This bill will sever that anchor and set rural health care adrift. Here's how flawed the Republican plan is. The danger they're causing for rural hospitals is so great, Republicans have had to create a rural hospital relief fund. It is a Band-Aid on an amputation. I can tell you one thing I know for sure is only in Washington, D.C. would you create a relief fund to address a problem that you caused. How about you just not cut $1 trillion from Medicaid in the first place? Now, I wanted to get a sense of what rural America thought of this legislation. So last weekend, I held 4 town halls in 3 eastern Oregon counties. It's as rural as it gets. Donald Trump carried these counties overwhelmingly. One of them was Malheur County, where Donald Trump received more than 70% of the vote. This is where I held an open-to-all town hall meeting. It happens to have one of the highest Medicaid enrollments in the country. The message I heard was very clear and very loud. This bill will be a disaster for Malheur County on rural health. Now, health care is a top employer in America. If these cuts go through, the health care workforce in rural areas of our nation is going to be decimated. Nurses, doctors, and support staff will lose their jobs, and rural economies are going to suffer. Many of the Americans that will feel the consequences of this legislation today walk an economic tightrope. Many have multiple jobs. Millions more Americans will lose their benefits like home care and mental health and services that already fall far short of what our people expect. These are overwhelmingly kids, people with disabilities, seniors, all to pay for more tax cuts for multinational corporations and the ultra-wealthy. It's not just the cuts. It's also a whole lot more red tape, making it harder for people to get care. At the center of the Republican Medicaid changes is a bunch of red tape thickets designed to entrap people into a never-ending maze of AI chatbots and phone trees that make it impossible for them to get the coverage they need. And even if you manage to get through all that bureaucratic water torture and sign up for Medicaid, the Republican plan says if you lose your job, you lose your health care. Why would the Congress want to inflict that on more people? Nobody I could find wants these cuts, no matter their political persuasion, and I was in places that were bright red. I'm sure most of us can agree there's a real debate to be had on how we can make health care more affordable and accessible, but this bill achieves none of that. Let me mention seniors. My colleagues have touched on the elderly. 2 in 3 nursing home beds in America are covered by Medicaid. If Republicans pass this into law, conditions will deteriorate. Seniors will be forced out of their nursing homes or forced to move in with family that doesn't have the necessary skills to care for their aging parents or grandparents. Nursing homes would be forced to shut their doors as a result of these cuts during a time when states are in desperate need of more nursing home options, not fewer. The bill also repeals nursing home safety standards. That's going to mean fewer nurses in nursing homes. You would think that'd be a concern of Republicans in the Trump administration. But when the Finance Committee was considering the nomination of CMS Administrator Mehmet Oz, he said, and I quote, "I believe we can provide quality of care equivalent to having a nurse in that nursing home using tools and technologies." Dr. Oz was apparently talking about AI. And I said, "You're for cutting nurses. What's going to happen when an 85-year-old woman has to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night and needs some help?" He had no answers, but he's still being a big booster on artificial intelligence. I'm deeply troubled about what the Trump administration has in store for America's seniors. That's on top of the fact that home-based care that most seniors prefer will be one of the first benefits states are forced to cut because it's optional now rather than mandatory. Hundreds of thousands of seniors, Mr. President, are going to see a premium increase of about $200 a month. The bill also applies the worst forms of corporate red tape to the Affordable Care Act. Shorter enrollment periods, more verification forms, more hoops, more bureaucracy, more red tape for Americans who just want affordable health care. And the health care carnage may get worse with the Republican amendments coming up. It's my understanding that they're going to offer an amendment that would lower the federal Medicaid match for new enrollees in what's known as the Medicaid expansion. That was a key part of the Affordable Care Act that delivered affordable health care to roughly 21 million Americans last year. If this amendment is adopted, taken together with the other awful policies in the bill, it would amount to repealing the Affordable Care Act and making good on the 15-year Republican crusade to dismantle that law. Millions more working Americans, Mr. President, are going to lose their health insurance, and it would break a promise to the 41 states that have expanded Medicaid, many of them red states. These health care cuts aren't just going to be felt by Americans with Medicaid, and those who buy health insurance on their own are going to be similarly hit. Emergency room wait times are going to skyrocket, and premiums will spike. Families will be one lost job or financial calamity away from being tossed onto a safety net that has rips and tears everywhere you look. So many are going to fall between the cracks. I also wanted to touch on another horrendous provision on health care buried in the bill, the defunding of the Planned Parenthood program, and they're doing it in a way that's essentially a backdoor nationwide abortion ban. This provision is going to strip clinics of their funding and make it impossible for them to provide life-saving health care. Cancer screenings, annual exams, all of that will disappear for the people that rely on these clinics for basic care. The health care cuts are getting a big focus, Mr. President, with myself, my colleagues, because of the challenge for so many communities. But there's something else that's absolutely imperative. That's the clean energy bloodbath, and it certainly deserves attention. In the middle of the night, Friday into Saturday, the bill that was already a disaster for clean energy got much, much, much worse. What Republicans have on offer doesn't just repeal the tax credits that I wrote for wind and solar energy in the Finance Committee. Now we've got an actual massacre on our hands. This Republican plan actually taxes wind and solar, a new tax on the cheapest and easiest way to get new energy to the grid. At the same time, somebody tucked into the bill a brand new tax break for coal. So here we are, 2025, and the Senate is about to pass a bill that taxes wind and solar while subsidizing coal. It is so backward, it leaves you slack-jawed. When you look at this bill, it's awfully clear that the Republican goal is to destroy key sources of clean energy in America. It's a death sentence for the wind and solar industries in our country. a total abandonment of hundreds of thousands of workers who are about to lose their jobs as a direct result of the bill. The head of the North American Building Trades Union, that represents millions of construction workers, issued a stunning statement on the bill yesterday. I'll read a few select lines from the statement. He said, "It's the biggest job-killing bill in the history of the country," is how he described the Republican plan. "Staggering and unfathomable job loss, a threat to an estimated 1.75 million construction workers." And this union leader said it was the equivalent of terminating 1,000 Keystone XL pipelines. And it was another lifeline and competitive advantage to China in the race for global energy dominance. He also said critical infrastructure projects will be sacrificed at the altar of ideology. Mr. President, those were all direct quotes. Hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy investments under the Republican plan will simply disappear. Not government subsidies or handouts. These are private sector investments we will not have. And even worse, this is a guaranteed way to hike utility bills for families and businesses of all sizes in every nook and cranny of America. I have never seen this kind of economic self-sabotage. The demand for energy booms right now. Even the heads of companies involved in fossil fuels are saying to me and other members of Congress, we need solar quickly to get more electrons to the grid. But Republicans don't want to listen because this plan risks plunging us into an energy crisis. It would be a disaster and a total surrender to China and clean energy manufacturing. It's clear as a sunny day that all the talk from Donald Trump and Republicans about American energy dominance was just a fraud, nothing but a hollow campaign slogan. And I'll close with this. There is no question in my mind, Mr. President, the American people went to the polls in 2024 to vote for cheaper groceries, cheaper utilities, and cheaper gas. They didn't vote to kick 16 million people off their health care so Republicans can give more tax breaks to billionaires and corporations. They didn't vote for an energy crisis that benefits nobody except big oil investors. There is a real cost of living crisis facing American families right now. And this Senate ought to be focused on finding ways to lower drug prices, for example, expand access to quality and affordable health care, and bring down the cost of living. Instead, Republicans are using every ounce of their power to jam through another round of tax breaks for those at the very top, and they're doing it on the backs of everybody else. There are serious challenges ahead, Mr. President, and there's going to be a serious mess to clean up. But until then, countless Americans will needlessly suffer and die as a direct result of losing their health care under this legislation. I don't believe the American people are going to forget. On this side of the aisle, we'll make certain that this topic is something that's dealt with again and again until the American people finally get a fair shake. I yield the floor. Under this legislation, I don't believe the American people are going to forget. On this side of the aisle, we'll make certain that this topic
Mr. President.
is something that
Senator from Hawaii.
again and again until the American people finally get a
Presiding officer is a distinguished businessman. He understands capital flows. He understands investment. There are a lot of people in this chamber and across the country who on a non-ideological basis want a consistent tax code so that businesses can invest with certainty and predictability. So let's look at some of the numbers here in terms of the impact of this bill. This bill will kill 300,000 jobs in wind and solar per year. We're going to lose out on $450 billion in capital as thousands of projects go under. And because of that, we're going to generate about 500 gigawatts less energy in the next decade. Now, there was a time, and I lived through it as a politician, there was a time when people who wanted to take climate action
had to argue for that climate action because it is a planetary emergency, and there were trade-offs. And people on the other side said, look, as we try to take action to deal with this planetary crisis, we can't create shortages, we can't increase prices, we can't impede economic progress. All that has flipped. This bill will create shortages. This bill will impede economic progress. This bill will increase prices. The 500 gigawatts less energy in the next decade is pretty much exactly the amount of energy that we're going to need to meet rising demand. We are going to have energy shortages as a result of this legislation. And you don't have to love clean energy or be an environmentalist, and I love clean energy and I'm an environmentalist. But you don't have to care about the climate. I think you should. You don't have to care about the climate to understand that this is a basic question of supply and demand. Energy demand is soaring for the first time in decades, largely, not exclusively, but largely because of AI data centers. And our best chance of meeting it in the next few years is with wind and solar, not oil and gas. Even nuclear and geothermal are going to take a while. That is not just a political talking point or a preference of mine. It's just a fact that gas turbines are stuck in a years-long backlog. It's also a fact that 80% of the new capacity on the grid last year came from solar and storage. It's growing, it's cheap, it works. And there are hundreds more projects that are in the pipeline waiting to be hooked up. So the idea that we're going to kill the only energy that can be brought online in the short run, the very same week that half the country was meeting melting in a record heat wave, which left tens of thousands without power, is beyond absurd. Let's talk about how this bill does all of this damage. Specifically, it creates an impossible deadline for projects to be operational in order to claim the clean energy tax credits. Remember, these clean energy tax credits are federal law. They're on the books. So when you have a federal statute, it is not unreasonable as an investor to say, look, I got this tax credit, I'm going to get X percent back for my initial investment, and you do the pro forma, you do the underwriting, and you figure out that the thing pencils out. And now what they're saying is that you got to be operational in 60 days. If anyone has even built a deck in their front yard or tried to do an extension, nothing gets built in 60 days, certainly not a clean energy project. And it has to be placed in service. What does placed in service mean? It means not only do you have to have the thing built, you have to have a power purchase agreement through your Public Service Commission or Public Utilities Commission. You have to have a deal in place in the next 60 days after enactment, or you get nothing. So imagine you're a company investing in a solar or battery storage project. You've already put money down. You've secured land and a power purchase agreement, and you're working on permits. And when you started the project, the tax code said you could claim a credit to cover the upfront costs. Now, unless you are fully operational, you're out of luck. On average, a project takes 4 years to go through the full process. So even if you've already started that progress, you now have very, very little time to get it done. We are going to strand hundreds of billions of dollars in capital. And so the impact on price is going to be crazy. The impact on jobs is going to be crazy. But the impact on America as an investable proposition is the most dangerous part of this. I don't know that we've ever, through federal law, made a big subsidy, made a big bet on a certain industry, and then halfway through that process said, never mind, we didn't mean that, you're stuck. According to the Edison Electric Institute, and by the way, I can guarantee you this is the first and maybe last time I will ever quote the Edison Electric Institute. That'll cost people, not companies, people, ratepayers, $60 billion in this decade alone. Your electric bills are about to go up. A representative of a solar company in Hawaii put it this way: it is really unclear in the current version of the bill what the renewable energy industry even looks like if it were passed today. An owner of a solar company in Montana worried that the credits disappearing would force him to lay off half of his workers. He says, Montana is deeply red, but it's also a very practical place. And so green energy renewables became a taboo phrase somehow. The practical energy needs are undeniable, so we can get past our disagreements and about phraseology. We realize that electrons, watts, amps, it's all cheaper. A representative of a wind turbine company in Colorado said, I don't look at what we do as green or blue or red. An electron doesn't have a color, and that's the point. Electrons don't have color. Wanting cheap, abundant energy is not woke. Wanting a livable planet for today and for future generations is not radical. And wanting reliable power and to avoid blackouts and brownouts is not a leftist project. But even if you set all of that aside for a minute, the states that have benefited the most from these investments are Republican states. According to estimates, nearly 3/4 of clean energy manufacturing facilities are located in Republican states. It means that Republicans are going to pay more for energy. It means Republicans will lose jobs in clean energy because of a Republican bill. It means Republicans are going to have more blackouts in their homes and businesses. Gutting clean energy is not somehow owning the libs. And at least some Republicans in the Senate and House understand that, even if their votes have not manifested to say otherwise. Here's a letter from 21 House Republicans earlier this year. As our conference has long believed, an all-of-the-above energy approach combined with a robust advanced manufacturing sector will help support the United States position as a global energy leader. Countless American companies are utilizing sector-wide energy tax credits, many of which have enjoyed broad support in Congress to make major investments in domestic energy production and infrastructure for traditional and renewable sources alike. And it goes on, as energy demand continues to skyrocket, any modifications that inhibit our ability to deploy new energy production risk sparking an energy crisis. 21 House Republicans are worried about an energy crisis imposed by the Republican Congress. It goes on. This is especially true for energy credits with direct pass-through benefit to ratepayers, where such repeals would increase utility bills the very next day. This is not me, progressive senator from the state of Hawaii, who has made a career out of fighting climate change. This is 21 House Republicans saying, like, we're going to create a crisis here. Maybe we shouldn't pass this thing. A lot of this stuff benefits us. If we're all out here talking about all of the above, why are we cutting off our nose to spite our face just because someone wants a talking point? Like, people are literally going to lose their jobs immediately upon enactment. America is going to become a very challenging place to make major investments in immediately upon enactment. The AI industry may move abroad immediately upon enactment, and prices will go up pretty much right away as well. A group of 175 mayors and local leaders wrote, for the first time, state and local governments, as well as essential nonprofit community organizations such as houses of worship, hospitals, and schools, can access the same clean energy tax credits as the private sector through elective pay. This has led to major projects in our communities like solar installations for town halls, alternative fueling infrastructure, and charging stations for local government fleets. After 1 year of direct pay implementation, over 1,200 organizations, including 500 state and local governments, are already accessing these incentives. We are excited about these projects and the benefits that they will bring to our communities. However, as local leaders, we are concerned that repealing these tax credits would create economic uncertainty in our communities, as it would prevent us from accessing those important benefits. You know, I grew up to understand Republican, look, I didn't grow up as a Republican, but I did understand Republicans were for avoiding unintended consequences. Republicans were against radical change too quickly. Republicans wanted a solid business environment that people could rely upon. This is literally none of that. This is ideology manifesting itself as energy policy. And what's going to happen is people are going to lose their jobs and pay tons more for electricity. The building trades union called this bill, quote, the biggest job-killing bill in the history of this country. And they go on, simply put, it is the equivalent of terminating more than 1,000 Keystone XL pipeline projects. I've been here for a while. Keystone XL was a big deal to our friends in labor. I had some very tough conversations with my friends in labor about how important that project was to them and how it was in tension with some of our climate goals. But listen to what they say. It is the equivalent of terminating 1,000 Keystone XL pipeline projects. These guys are not me or Jeff Merkley or Eddie Markey or Sheldon Whitehouse or Martin Heinrich or Rep. Ocasio-Cortez or any climate advocate. This is the building trades. And they're saying this is the biggest job killer perhaps in American history. We actually don't have to do this, you know? The impetus behind this bill was essentially border spending and preventing the Trump tax cuts from expiring. And then a bunch of stuff got added on because that's what happens. And we were there for our own version of this, our own BBB, our own Build Back Better, and everybody in your party piles on with something new. And then the thing becomes a really challenging thing to pass because everybody's got their hobby horse. And somebody's hobby horse is not just to have an all-of-the-above energy strategy, but to go out of your way to kill clean energy. It doesn't matter that it's going to raise prices. It doesn't matter that it's going to kill jobs. People at all levels in the public and private sectors across the political spectrum are all saying the same thing, which is this is a bad bill for regular people.